The Segmentum Ultima stands as one of the 5 great administrative divisions of the Imperium of mankind, stretching across the eastern reaches of the galaxy, from the borders of the Segmentum Solar to the distant void of the Eastern Fringe. This vast expanse encompasses hundreds of thousands of star systems, countless human worlds, and some of the most strategically vital territory humanity has ever claimed. While the Segmentum Solar maintains its position as the political and spiritual heart of the Imperium by virtue of housing Holy Terra itself, the Segmentum Ultima rivals it in sheer territorial extent and has long served as the Imperium's primary zone of expansion and resource extraction. The boundaries of the Segmentum Ultima begin roughly at the galactic core's eastern edge, where it meets the Segmentum Solar along a border that has remained administratively stable for 10,000 years. From there, it extends outward through the Ultima Macharia and beyond, reaching toward the galaxy's rim, where human settlement grows increasingly sparse and the light of the astronomicon dims to a barely perceptible flicker. The northern reaches brush against the Segmentum Obscurus, creating border regions where jurisdictional authority often overlaps, and where some of the most dangerous regions of space exist in a state of perpetual ambiguity. To the south, the Segmentum Ultima shares its longest border with the Segmentum Tempestus, a boundary marked more by administrative convention than any natural astronomical feature. The astronomicon's reach proves crucial to understanding the functional limits of the Segmentum Ultima. This psychic beacon, projected from Terra by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers daily and focused through the Emperor's will, extends approximately 50,000 light-years in all directions, though its strength diminishes with distance. In the Segmentum Ultima's core regions, closer to Terra, navigators can perceive the astronomicon with crystalline clarity, allowing for relatively safe and accurate warp travel. As one ventures further toward the Eastern Fringe, however, the beacon's light grows fainter. Beyond a certain threshold, warp travel becomes exponentially more dangerous, with navigators forced to make shorter jumps and spend more time calculating their positions relative to known stellar landmarks. This practical limitation has historically defined the true edge of Imperial expansion far more effectively than any decree from Terra. The Ultima Macharia represents one of the Segmentum's most densely populated and strategically significant subsectors. Named in honor of Lord Commander Solar Macharius, whose legendary crusade in the 41st millennium pushed the Imperium's borders further than they had reached since the Great Crusade itself. This region contains numerous hive worlds, forge worlds, and fortress systems that serve as staging grounds for military operations deeper into the Segmentum. The density of human settlement here creates a web of trade routes and communication relays that function with relative efficiency, though still subject to the inherent unpredictability of warp travel. Forge worlds like Griffon IV, before its destruction during the 13th Black Crusade's aftermath, produced war materiel on a scale that supplied entire Crusade fleets. The loss of such production centers has created strategic vulnerabilities that the Imperium continues to struggle with in the current era. The Dominion of Storms occupies a particularly treacherous region of the Segmentum Ultima, where warp storms manifest with unusual frequency and intensity. This subsector has earned its name through millennia of navigational disasters and lost fleets. The local warp-real space interface exhibits severe instability, with storms erupting without warning and sometimes persisting for decades or even centuries. Entire systems have been cut off from the wider Imperium for generations, their populations regressing to pre-industrial or even feudal states before contact could be re-established. The Adeptus Mechanicus has devoted considerable resources to studying the astronomical phenomena that might explain this instability, but no definitive answers have emerged. Some tech priests theorize that ancient xenotech or archaeotech installations might be generating interference, while others point to unusual concentrations of psyker births in the region as a potential contributing factor. The northeastern regions of the Segmentum Ultima brush against territory that technically falls within the Segmentum Obscurus, creating zones of ambiguous jurisdiction that include the notorious Ghoul Stars. This region exists at the very edge of reliable Imperial control, where the Astronomican's light barely penetrates, and where human worlds exist in a state of near-constant siege. The Ghoul Stars have earned their grim reputation through countless encounters with entities that defy easy classification. Xenos species unknown to the wider Imperium lurk in these systems, and reports from the rare survivors of expeditions into the region speak of technologies that predate humanity's rise and of structures that seem to exist partially outside normal spacetime. The Death Specters chapter of the Adeptus Astartes maintains a vigil over this region from their fortress monastery, though even these superhuman warriors struggle to contain the threats that periodically emerge from the darkness. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor prioritized the Segmentum Ultima for expansion with clear strategic reasoning. The region contained vast numbers of human-settled worlds, remnants of humanity's expansion during the Dark Age of technology that had survived Old Night in various states of technological and cultural development. These worlds represented both a resource to be reclaimed and a responsibility to be shouldered. The Emperor's vision demanded the reunification of humanity under a single banner, and the Segmentum Ultima held perhaps the greatest concentration of lost human colonies outside the Segmentum Solar itself. The Primarchs led their legions in systematic campaigns to bring these worlds into compliance, whether through negotiation, intimidation, or outright conquest. The resource wealth of the Segmentum Ultima proved equally attractive to the Imperial war machine. Mineral-rich systems, agri-worlds capable of feeding billions, and forge worlds with intact standard template construct databases all fell under Imperial control during the Great Crusade's expansion phase. The Ultramarines, operating from their base in Ultramar within the Segmentum's borders, exemplified the systematic approach to conquest and integration that characterized the most successful campaigns. Robout Guilliman's methods of establishing stable governance structures and functional supply chains became the template for Imperial administration across the Segmentum, though many regions never achieved the efficiency and prosperity of the Ultramar sector itself. The formation of the Cicatrix Maledictum in the closing years of the 41st millennium fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the Segmentum Ultima. This vast warp rift, also known as the Great Rift, tore across the galaxy from the Eye of Terror to the Hadex Anomaly and beyond, splitting the Imperium into two distinct zones. The portion of the Segmentum Ultima that fell on the Terran side of the rift became part of what is now called the Imperium Sanctus, maintaining relatively stable contact with Holy Terra and benefiting from the continued guidance of the Astronomican. These regions have been able to receive reinforcements, supplies, and strategic direction from the Segmentum Solar, allowing them to weather the storms of the Dark Imperium era with some measure of coordination. The territories on the far side of the Great Rift tell a different story entirely. These regions, now designated as part of the Imperium Nihilus or the Dark Imperium, have been effectively cut off from Terra. The Astronomican's light does not penetrate the roiling chaos of the Cicatrix Maledictum, leaving navigators on the far side blind to its guidance. Warp travel in these regions has become exponentially more dangerous, with many systems completely isolated from their neighbors. Entire sectors have gone dark, their fates unknown to the wider Imperium. Some worlds have undoubtedly fallen to Xenos invasion, chaos corruption, or simple collapse of their support infrastructure. Others continue to fight on, their defenders unaware whether the Imperium they serve even still exists, or if they have become the last bastions of human civilization in their corner of the galaxy. The strategic implications of this division cannot be overstated. The Segmentum Ultima's eastern reaches, already distant from Terra, and operating with a degree of autonomy born of necessity, now function as independent zones of control. Chapter Masters, Lord Commanders, and Planetary Governors make decisions that would previously have required approval from higher authorities on Terra, simply because communication with those authorities has become impossible. Some have risen to the challenge admirably, organizing local defense pacts and mutual aid agreements that have preserved Imperial control over significant territories. Others have proven less capable, their failures resulting in the loss of entire systems to the enemies of mankind. The realm of Ultramar stands as perhaps the most successful implementation of Imperial governance anywhere in the galaxy, a functioning sub-empire within the greater Imperium that has maintained stability, prosperity, and military strength for over 10,000 years. Located in the Eastern Fringe of the Segmentum Ultima, Ultramar represents what the Imperium could have been if the Emperor's vision had been fully realized across all human space. The region's success stems directly from the organizational genius of Robout Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, whose philosophies of efficient administration and rational governance transformed a collection of disparate worlds into a cohesive political entity that continues to function according to his principles even during his long absence. The original Ultramar consisted of 8 worlds that Guilliman had brought under his control before reuniting with the Emperor. These core systems included Macrag, Talisar, Quintarn, Tarantis, Calth, Ix, Espandor, and Prandium, though Prandium was later destroyed by the Tyranid invasion of Hive Fleet Behemoth. Each world contributed specific resources and capabilities to the collective whole, creating an interdependent network that proved remarkably resilient to external shocks. The system worked because Guilliman had designed it to work, with redundancies built into supply chains and governance structures that could adapt to changing circumstances without requiring constant oversight from Macrag. Following the opening of the Great Rift in Guilliman's resurrection, Ultramar underwent its most significant expansion since the Great Crusade. The Indomitus Crusade, led by the returned Primarch, reclaimed vast swathes of territory in the Imperium's darkest hour. As the Crusade progressed through the Eastern Fringe, Guilliman made the strategic decision to expand Ultramar's borders to encompass approximately 500 worlds. This expansion was not mere territorial aggrandizement, but a calculated response to the Imperium's fractured state. With Terra cut off from much of the galaxy by the Cicatrix Maledictum, Guilliman recognized the need for stable regional power centers that could maintain Imperial authority and provide protection to human populations without relying on directives from Holy Terra. The 500 worlds of Ultramar now encompass a diverse array of planet types and specializations. Hive worlds provide industrial output and manpower. Agri-worlds produce food surpluses that prevent the famines common in other Imperial sectors. Forge worlds maintain technological capabilities that allow Ultramar to produce its own weapons, vehicles, and equipment without complete dependence on Mars. Fortress worlds guard strategic approaches and serve as staging grounds for military operations. The expansion incorporated worlds that had been isolated by warp storms, planets that had fallen to Xeno's invasion and required liberation, and systems that had maintained their Imperial loyalty through centuries of isolation, but desperately needed integration into a larger support network. The governmental structure of Ultramar operates through a system of tetrarchs, 4 regional governors who oversee major subdivisions of the realm and report directly to the chapter master of the Ultramarines, or to Guilliman himself when he is present. This system provides a clear chain of command while distributing administrative burden across multiple competent individuals rather than concentrating all decision-making authority in a single location. Each tetrarch governs a cluster of worlds, making decisions on resource allocation, defense priorities, and internal policies within their jurisdiction, while coordinating with their counterparts to maintain the realm's overall coherence. The tetrarchs themselves are typically drawn from the nobility of Ultramar's core worlds, individuals who have demonstrated both administrative competence and unwavering loyalty to the Imperium. Unlike many Imperial governors who view their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment, the tetrarchs operate within a system that emphasizes duty and efficiency. Corruption exists in Ultramar as it does everywhere humans govern, but the institutional structures Guilliman established create checks on abuses of power that function far more effectively than the Byzantine bureaucracy of the wider administratum. Regular audits, transparent record-keeping, and the ever-present possibility of inspection by Ultramarines officers all serve to keep officials focused on their responsibilities rather than their personal interests. The quality of life in Ultramar exceeds that of comparable Imperial territories by substantial margins. citizens have access to reliable food supplies, functional infrastructure, and legal systems that operate with relative fairness and predictability. Education is widespread rather than restricted to the upper classes, producing a population capable of operating complex machinery and understanding technical manuals rather than treating such devices as sacred mysteries. Healthcare, while not approaching the standards of the dark age of technology, functions well enough that preventable diseases rarely reach epidemic proportions. These advantages stem from Guilliman's fundamental belief that effective governance requires treating citizens as valuable resources to be maintained rather than expendable assets to be consumed. The practical implementation of Guilliman's philosophies extends to military organization as well. Ultramar maintains its own defense forces separate from the Astra Militarum regiments raised for service elsewhere in the Imperium. These Ultramar defense auxilia receive training and equipment that surpass what most Imperial Guard regiments can expect. They drill regularly, maintain their weapons properly, and operate within a command structure that values tactical flexibility over rigid adherence to outdated doctrine. When Tyranid hive fleets or chaos warbands threaten Ultramar's borders, these forces respond with a level of coordination and effectiveness that reflects their superior preparation and support infrastructure. Macragge serves as the capital world of Ultramar and the homeworld of the Ultramarines chapter. The planet orbits its star in the Macragge system, a location that has been fortified over 10 millennia into one of the most defensible positions in the Eastern Fringe. Orbital defense platforms, monitor ships, and weapon satellites create overlapping fields of fire that would shred any invasion fleet attempting to reach the planet's surface. The system's outer reaches contain early warning stations and patrol routes that ensure nothing approaches Macragge without being detected and identified long before it poses a threat. The planet itself divides into distinct geographical and political regions. The northern polar regions, characterized by harsh mountain ranges and severe weather conditions, played a crucial role in Guilliman's early life. The fortress where Connor Gallen discovered the infant Primarch stands in these northern mountains, a structure that has been preserved and maintained as a site of historical significance. The exact circumstances of Guilliman's arrival on Macragge remain somewhat mysterious, as with all the Primarch's dispersal from Terra, but the northern fortress marks the beginning of his documented history on the world he would transform. The Fortress of Hera dominates Macragge's capital region, a massive structure that serves as the chapter monastery of the Ultramarines and the administrative center of their operations. The fortress complex sprawls across kilometers of carefully engineered terrain, incorporating training facilities, armories, libraries, and command centers that allow the chapter to coordinate operations across multiple star systems simultaneously. The architecture reflects Guilliman's preference for functional elegance over ostentatious display. Every element serves a purpose, from the overlapping fields of fire provided by defensive towers to the layout of corridors that allows rapid movement of troops to any threatened section. Within the Fortress of Hera, the Temple of Correction serves a specific and somber function. This chamber houses the sarcophagus where Guilliman's body rested in stasis for 10,000 years after his near-fatal wounding by the demon Primarch Fulgrim. The Ultramarines maintained a constant vigil over their Primarch's body, hoping against hope that some technology or miracle might restore him to life. The temple became a place of pilgrimage for Ultramarines and a reminder of the price paid during the heresy. Following Guilliman's resurrection by the intervention of the Eldari god Unid's avatar Ivrain and the technological capabilities of Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call, the temple has taken on new meaning as a symbol of hope and renewal rather than loss. The planet's southern regions contain the majority of Macragge's population centers and industrial facilities. Cities built according to rational urban planning principles house millions of citizens who work in manufactorums, administrative offices, and service industries that support both the civilian government and the Ultramarines chapter. The cities feature wide boulevards that allow efficient movement of people and goods public spaces that provide areas for recreation and community gathering, and infrastructure systems that deliver clean water and remove waste with reliable efficiency. These seem like basic necessities, yet they represent luxuries on many Imperial worlds where populations huddle in sprawling hive cities choked with pollution and decay. Talisar, another of Ultramar's core worlds, specializes in void warfare training and maintains extensive orbital shipyards. The planet's population has developed a culture centered on naval service, with families passing down traditions of shipboard duty through generations. Talisar's contribution to Ultramar's defense extends beyond simple ship construction. The world's academies train void warfare specialists who understand the complexities of three-dimensional combat in the depths of space, officers who can coordinate fleet actions across vast distances, and engineers who can keep vessels functioning under combat conditions. These specialists serve not only aboard Ultramarines' vessels, but throughout Ultramar's defensive fleets. Espandor serves as a major recruitment world for the Ultramarines, its population providing a steady stream of aspirants who undergo the brutal selection process and transformation into space marines. The world's harsh environment and warrior culture produce young men with the physical resilience and mental toughness necessary to survive the implantation of gene seed and the psychological conditioning required of Adeptus Astartes. Espandor's cities celebrate martial achievement while maintaining the civic responsibility that characterizes Ultramar's culture. Warriors are honored, but they are expected to serve the community rather than dominate it. Calth occupies a unique and tragic position within Ultramar's hierarchy of worlds. Before the heresy, Calth functioned as a major fleet anchorage and supply depot, its strategic location making it ideal for supporting military operations throughout the Eastern Fringe. The planet's surface, while habitable, was less hospitable than many other worlds in Ultramar, leading to significant development of underground facilities that could provide controlled environments for habitation and industry. These cavern cities extended deep into Calth's crust, vast complexes that housed millions of citizens and stored supplies sufficient to support fleet operations for extended campaigns. The Battle of Calth during the Horus Heresy transformed the world forever. The Word-Bearers Legion, under the command of First Captain Corferon and operating on orders from their Primarch Lorgar, launched a surprise attack on the Ultramarines' forces gathered at Calth. The betrayal came without warning during what the Ultramarines believed to be a muster for a joint operation. Word-Bearers' vessels opened fire on their supposed allies, while ground forces that had been welcomed as brothers revealed their true allegiance and began slaughtering Ultramarines and Calth's civilian population alike. The Word-Bearers' attack included a weapon of catastrophic scale. They deployed a device that damaged Calth's sun, causing it to emit deadly radiation that scoured the planet's surface. Within hours, the surface became uninhabitable, the atmosphere itself becoming toxic to human life. Millions died in the initial attack and the subsequent radiation poisoning. The Ultramarines' forces on Calth, led by Captain Remus Ventanis and other officers after their command structure was shattered, fought a desperate defense that transitioned from the surface to the underground arcologies as the planet above became a hell of radiation and fire. The underground war on Calth continued for years after the initial betrayal. Word-Bearers' forces that had infiltrated deep into the cavern systems waged a campaign of terror and sabotage, summoning demons and corrupting vital systems. The Ultramarines hunted them through kilometers of tunnels and chambers, fighting battles in the dark, where the slightest breach in environmental seals meant death by radiation exposure. The civilian population, those who survived the initial attack, huddled in sealed sections while Space Marines fought and died to protect them from both the traitors and the corrupted atmosphere that seeped into damaged sections. In the 10,000 years since the heresy, Calth has never fully recovered. The planet's surface remains a wasteland of radioactive dust and shattered ruins, a monument to Word-Bearer treachery that the Ultramarines have deliberately preserved rather than attempting to repair. The cavern cities continue to function, their populations living entirely underground in artificial environments. Advanced life support systems maintain breathable atmosphere and comfortable temperatures in the inhabited sections, while sealed doors and checkpoints guard against any breach that might expose citizens to the poisoned world above. The war in Calth's depths never truly ended. Word-bearers and their demon allies still lurk in the deepest, most isolated sections of the underground complexes. Ultramarines forces conduct regular sweeps through contested zones, purging corrupted areas and reclaiming sections that had been lost to chaos influence. The fighting takes place in absolute darkness, broken only by weapon flashes and the eerie glow of warp-spawned entities. Veterans of the Calth Underground War develop a particular mindset, accustomed to fighting in confined spaces where every corner might hide an ambush, and where the enemy could be human, demon, or something worse. The Tau Empire represents one of the youngest spacefaring civilizations in the galaxy, yet in the mere 6,000 years since achieving faster-than-light travel, they have expanded across hundreds of worlds and established themselves as a significant power in the Eastern Fringe of the Segmentum Ultima. Their rapid expansion stands in stark contrast to the Imperium's 10,000-year struggle to maintain its territory, a fact that deeply troubles Imperial strategists who recognize the implications of such aggressive growth. The Tau pose a unique threat to Imperial sovereignty, not through overwhelming military might, though their forces are formidable, but through their ideology of the greater good and their willingness to accept alien species and even humans into their empire as equals rather than slaves or subjects. The Tau homeworld of Tiao lies in the Perdis Rift region of the Eastern Fringe, a location that kept them isolated from the wider galaxy until relatively recently in galactic terms. During the Age of Strife, a period of warp storms that lasted roughly 5,000 years, the Tau remained trapped on their homeworld, unable to develop space travel while the storms raged. This isolation proved fortuitous in retrospect, as it spared them from the countless Xenos extinctions and human conflicts that characterized that dark era. When the warp storms finally receded, the Tau emerged as a unified species under the guidance of the Ethereal Caste, a mysterious group of leaders whose pheromone-based influence over other Tau remains a subject of speculation among Imperial xenobiologists who have studied captured specimens. The Tau organized their society into a rigid caste system that determines every individual's role from birth. The Fire Caste provides warriors, the Earth Caste handles construction and engineering, the Water Caste manages diplomacy and commerce, the Air Caste pilots spacecraft and aircraft, and the Ethereal Caste rules overall with absolute authority. This system creates a society of specialists where each caste develops expertise in their designated field without the inefficiencies of individuals attempting to move between roles. Imperial observers note the similarities to the Imperium's own specialized organizations, though the Tau implementation operates with far greater flexibility and less bureaucratic overhead. The first sphere expansion began shortly after the Tau achieved faster-than-light capability through their development of a technology they call the Ether Drive. This propulsion system allows Tau vessels to enter a shallow layer of the warp, though they lack true warp drives and navigators. Their journeys take longer than comparable Imperial voyages, and they cannot make the vast jumps that Imperial ships routinely attempt, but their method proves safer and more reliable for the relatively short distances between systems in their expansion zone. The first sphere saw the Tau claim worlds in the immediate vicinity of Tiao, establishing the Sept worlds that would become the foundations of their empire. Tiao itself, often called the first sphere in Tau terminology, serves as the empire's capital and the seat of the Ethereal Supreme. The planet's cities showcase Tau architectural preferences for sweeping curves and integration with natural landscapes, a stark departure from the Gothic brutalism of Imperial construction. Massive towers rise above carefully maintained forests and waterways, their surfaces smooth and white, studded with sensor arrays and weapons emplacements that demonstrate the Tau understanding that even their homeworld requires defense. The population centers house billions of Tau citizens who work in industries ranging from battlesuit manufacturing to advanced research facilities, developing the next generation of weapons and equipment. Vyorla, whose name translates as hot-blooded in the Tau language, earned its designation through the aggressive nature of its fire-caste warriors. The Sept world orbits close to its sun, creating a hot climate that supposedly influences the temperament of those born there, though Imperial xenologists dismiss such environmental determinism as superstition. Viola's military doctrine emphasizes rapid strikes and overwhelming firepower, with fire warriors from this sept favoring aggressive tactics that close with the enemy quickly before unleashing devastating volleys. The sept contributed significantly to the Tau response to the Damocles Crusade, with Viola cadres earning a reputation among Imperial forces for their refusal to yield ground and their tendency to counterattack even when outnumbered. Sassia represents the opposite end of the tactical spectrum from Viola. This sept world maintains the largest population in the Tau Empire outside Tiao itself, and its fire-caste warriors emphasize discipline and coordinated firepower over individual aggression. Sassia doctrine focuses on establishing strong defensive positions and methodically destroying enemy forces through concentrated fire from multiple supporting units. Their battlesuit pilots train extensively in coordinated operations, with teams of crisis suits moving in perfect synchronization to maximize their effectiveness. Imperial forces engaging Sassia cadres report facing walls of pulse fire that eliminate entire squads before they can close to effective range. Daleth occupies a position of commercial and diplomatic importance within the Tau Empire. The Sept world serves as a major trading hub where water-caste negotiators conduct business with alien species and coordinate the Empire's economic activities. Daleth's military forces reflect this commercial focus, with fire warriors trained to operate in urban environments and to minimize collateral damage to valuable infrastructure. The Sept has absorbed numerous alien auxiliary species into its population, creating a cosmopolitan environment where Kroot mercenaries, Vespid warriors, and even human converts live alongside Tau citizens. Imperial intelligence regards Daleth as particularly dangerous not for its military strength, but for its effectiveness at subverting Imperial populations through propaganda and offers of better living conditions under Tau rule. The Second Sphere expansion pushed Tau borders significantly outward from their core worlds, claiming systems that brought them into contact with the Imperium for the first time. Imperial forces conducting routine patrol operations in the Damocles Gulf region began encountering Tau exploration fleets, and shortly thereafter, established Tau colonies on worlds the Imperium considered within its sphere of influence. Initial contacts resulted in small-scale skirmishes as both sides probed each other's capabilities and intentions. The Tau's advanced technology, particularly their battlesuits and pulse weapons, came as an unpleasant surprise to Imperial commanders who had assumed any newly discovered Xeno species would possess inferior equipment. The Third Sphere expansion brought the Tau into direct conflict with the Imperium on a scale that could no longer be ignored by the Administratum. Tau fleets began claiming worlds that had been under Imperial control, offering human populations a choice between continued service to the Emperor or integration into the Tau Empire under the philosophy of the greater good. Some worlds resisted, their planetary defense forces fighting desperate actions against Tau invasion forces. Others, particularly those where Imperial rule had been harsh or neglectful, accepted Tau offers with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The loss of Imperial worlds to Xeno's persuasion rather than simple conquest represented a new kind of threat that the Imperium's military doctrine had not adequately addressed. Commander Farsight, originally named Shasso Viola Shavakai's Monter, led Tau forces during the Third Sphere expansion with a level of tactical brilliance that earned him legendary status among both Tau and Imperial forces. His campaigns demonstrated an understanding of combined arms warfare and strategic flexibility that surpassed most Tau commanders. Farsight's forces liberated worlds from Orc occupation, defeated Chaos incursions, and pushed back Imperial counteroffensives with a string of victories that seemed to validate the Tau's belief in their destiny to bring the greater good to the galaxy. His signature battlesuit, the XV-82 Crisis Iridium battlesuit, became instantly recognizable on battlefields across the expansion zone. The Farsight enclaves emerged from a schism that shocked the Tau Empire to its core. During operations on the world of Arthas Malak, Farsight and his forces encountered something that fundamentally altered his understanding of the universe. The exact nature of what occurred remains unclear to Imperial intelligence, but Farsight returned from that campaign changed. He began questioning the ethereal caste's absolute authority, a heresy within Tau society that would normally result in immediate execution or mind-wiping. Rather than submit to ethereal judgment, Farsight led his forces into self-imposed exile beyond the established borders of the Tau Empire, claiming a region of space that became known as the Farsight Enclaves. The Enclaves operate as a separate Tau civilization that maintains the basic structure of Tau society, but rejects ethereal rule. Farsight established his capital on the world of Viorlos, fortifying the system against both Tau attempts to reclaim their wayward commander and external threats from orcs and chaos forces. The Enclave's military forces retain the technological sophistication of the main Tau Empire, while developing their own tactical doctrines that emphasize close combat more than standard Tau practice. Farsight himself wields the Dawn Blade, an ancient weapon of unknown origin that he recovered during his campaigns, which has somehow extended his life far beyond normal Tau lifespans. The relationship between the Tau Empire and the Farsight Enclaves exists in a state of Cold War. The ethereal caste officially denounces Farsight as a traitor and forbids contact with his forces, yet they have not committed the resources necessary to crush the Enclaves militarily. Some Imperial analysts suggest the Ethereals recognize that Farsight's forces serve as a useful buffer against threats from the galactic core, while others theorize that failed attempts to retake the Enclaves convince the Ethereals that the cost of victory would exceed any benefit. The Enclaves, for their part, maintain a defensive posture toward the main empire, while focusing their military efforts on holding their territory against orcs and other Xenos threats. The Fourth Sphere expansion represented the Tau Empire's most ambitious territorial grab to date. The Ethereal Supreme authorized the construction of a massive fleet that would push Tau borders across the Stardite Nexus, a region of space that would bring them into conflict with Imperial holdings throughout the Damocles Gulf and beyond. The expansion fleet assembled at Daleth, gathering forces from every sept world and incorporating massive numbers of auxiliary troops from client species. The fleet's departure marked a moment of triumph for the Tau, a demonstration of their empire's growing power and confidence. The Fourth Sphere fleet's journey went catastrophically wrong. The vessels entered the warp using an experimental drive system meant to allow faster travel than standard Tau ether drives. Something went wrong during the transit, and the fleet became trapped in the warp for a subjective period that the survivors refused to discuss in detail. Imperial intelligence has intercepted fragmentary reports suggesting the Tau experienced direct exposure to demonic entities, an encounter that shattered their materialistic worldview and left deep psychological scars. When the fleet finally emerged from the warp, they found themselves on the far side of the Great Rift in what is now the Imperium Nihilus, far from their intended destination and cut off from the main Tau Empire. The survivors of the Fourth Sphere established themselves in their new location, claiming worlds and building a separate Tau presence in the Imperium Nihilus. These Tau differ from their cousins in the main empire in significant ways. Their exposure to the warp's horrors has made them paranoid and xenophobic, particularly toward their own auxiliary species. Reports indicate Fourth Sphere Tau have massacred entire populations of Kroot and other auxiliaries, blaming them for attracting demonic attention during the warp transit. This represents a fundamental break from the greater goods philosophy of cooperation between species, creating a faction of Tau who more closely resemble the Imperium's xenophobic attitudes. The Fifth Sphere expansion commenced after the opening of the Great Rift, with Tau forces taking advantage of Imperial disarray to claim additional territory. This expansion has proven more cautious than previous efforts, with Tau commanders clearly having learned lessons from the Fourth Sphere's disaster. The Fifth Sphere forces focus on consolidating gains and fortifying conquered worlds rather than pushing recklessly forward. They have established strong defensive positions in the Nemyr Atoll and other regions, creating a network of mutually supporting bases that can resist Imperial counter-offensives while providing staging grounds for future expansion. The Damocles Crusade represented the Imperium's most significant military response to Tau expansion. The Administratum finally recognized that the Tau threat required more than local defense forces and dispatched a full Crusade fleet to push the Xenos back and reclaim lost worlds. The Crusade's forces included multiple regiments of Imperial Guard, several Space Marine contingents, and supporting assets from the Imperial Navy. The campaign began with significant Imperial successes, as Crusade forces leveraged their superior numbers and experience to retake several worlds that had fallen to Tau control. The battles of the Damocles Crusade demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of Tau military doctrine when facing a determined Imperial offensive. Tau forces excelled in defensive operations, using their superior range and firepower to inflict heavy casualties on Imperial forces attempting to assault fortified positions. Imperial commanders learned quickly that frontal assaults against prepared Tau positions resulted in unacceptable losses, as pulse rifles and railguns eliminated entire companies before they could close to effective range. The Tau's mobility, provided by their devilfish transports and crisis battlesuit teams, allowed them to redeploy rapidly and concentrate forces at threatened points. However, the Tau struggled when Imperial forces managed to close to melee range, or when Space Marines deployed via drop pod directly into Tau lines. The Fire Caste's doctrine emphasizes ranged combat, and their troops receive minimal training in close quarters fighting. Imperial forces that survived the killing fields of Tau firepower and reached melee range found themselves facing warriors ill-equipped for that style of combat. Space Marine assault squads proved particularly effective, using jump packs to bypass Tau fire lanes and crash directly into fire warrior formations that broke and fled rather than standing to fight hand-to-hand. The Crusade pushed deep into Tau space, threatening several Sept worlds and forcing the Tau to commit increasing numbers of troops to halt the Imperial advance. The Water Caste attempted diplomatic overtures, suggesting negotiations and offering to return some captured worlds in exchange for recognition of Tau sovereignty over others. Imperial commanders rejected these offers, their orders from Terra clear. All Tau-held territory must be reclaimed and the Xenos threat eliminated. The Crusade appeared poised to achieve its objectives when external circumstances forced a dramatic change in Imperial strategy. The approach of a Tyranid hive fleet into the Damocles Gulf region created an immediate threat that superseded the campaign against the Tau. Imperial reconnaissance detected the distinctive biosignatures of Tyranid vessels entering the region, their numbers suggesting a splinter fleet of significant size. The Tyranids represented an existential threat to both Imperial and Tau forces in the region, as the hive fleet would consume all biomass regardless of species or allegiance. Imperial commanders faced an impossible choice: continue the crusade against the Tau and risk being caught between two enemies, or cease offensive operations and redeploy forces to meet the Tyranid threat. The decision to implement a ceasefire with the Tau came from the highest levels of Crusade command, though it remains controversial among Imperial officers to this day. The ceasefire agreement established a demilitarized zone between Imperial and Tau space, with both sides agreeing to halt offensive operations and focus on the Tyranid threat. The arrangement was explicitly temporary, a tactical necessity rather than any recognition of Tau legitimacy. Imperial forces redeployed to defensive positions, preparing to face the Tyranid invasion while maintaining watch on Tau forces to ensure they honored the ceasefire. The Ethereal Caste's expansion philosophy poses a long-term threat to Imperial sovereignty that extends beyond simple territorial loss. The greater good ideology presents an alternative to Imperial rule that appeals to human populations suffering under their administratum's inefficient and often brutal governance. Tau propaganda emphasizes practical benefits, reliable food supplies, functioning infrastructure, technological advancement, and a voice in governance through the Water Caste's administrative system. For populations on worlds where imperial rule means grinding poverty, arbitrary justice, and the constant threat of being tithed to death for imperial guard regiments or labor gangs, these promises hold genuine appeal. Human populations within Tau-controlled space, designated as Gevessa in the Tau language, live under conditions that imperial citizens would find almost unrecognizable. They receive education, healthcare, and opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth or connections. The Tau do not demand worship or religious devotion, viewing the imperial cult as primitive superstition to be gently discouraged rather than violently suppressed. Gevessa serve in auxiliary military units, work in industries producing goods for the Tau Empire, and participate in local governance under water caste supervision. Their material conditions typically exceed those of equivalent imperial citizens by substantial margins. The ideological threat this represents cannot be overstated. Every human world that accepts Tau rule provides proof that alternatives to the Imperium exist, that humanity need not serve the Emperor to survive and prosper. The ecclesiarchy regards this as the most dangerous heresy, worse in some ways than chaos corruption, because it does not require demons or sorcery, only the promise of better living conditions and rational governance. Imperial forces that reclaim worlds from Tau control face the problem of populations who actively resist liberation, having experienced life under Xeno's rule and found it preferable to imperial governance. The Tyranids emerged from the intergalactic void as the most alien threat humanity has ever encountered, organisms so fundamentally different from terrestrial life that they challenge every assumption about biology, evolution, and the nature of consciousness itself. Unlike the orcs with their crude joy in violence, or chaos with its corrupting promises, or even the Tau with their naive ideology, the Tyranids possess no capacity for negotiation, no political structure to exploit, no ideology to counter. They exist solely to consume, to strip worlds of every scrap of organic matter and move on to the next feeding ground. The hive fleets that have invaded the Eastern Fringe of the Segmentum Ultima represent merely the vanguard of a threat that may dwarf all other enemies of mankind combined, tendrils reaching into the galaxy from a main body whose true size remains unknown. The first contact with the species that would become known as Tyranids occurred in the 745th year of the 41st millennium, when the Imperium lost contact with the Tyran system. Investigation fleets found the worlds completely scoured of life, their atmospheres stripped, their oceans drained, leaving nothing but barren rock. The populations, the ecosystems, the very bacteria in the soil had been consumed with systematic efficiency that left Imperial observers struggling to comprehend what force could achieve such total devastation. The Adeptus Mechanicus xenobiologists who examined the dead worlds found trace genetic material from organisms unlike anything in Imperial records, creatures that appeared to be purpose-built weapons rather than naturally evolved life forms. Hive Fleet Behemoth announced its presence with attacks on Imperial worlds throughout the Eastern Fringe that escalated from isolated incidents to full-scale invasion within months. The fleet's approach followed a pattern that would become grimly familiar in subsequent Tyranid invasions. Advanced organisms called genostealers had infiltrated target worlds years or even decades earlier, establishing hidden cults among human populations that would rise up and sabotage defenses when the main fleet arrived. Psychic phenomena preceded the fleet itself, with astropaths reporting a growing pressure in the warp that manifested as a psychic scream, drowning out normal communication. The shadow in the warp, as this phenomenon became known, isolated target worlds from outside help and drove psychers mad with its alien presence. The bioships of Hive Fleet Behemoth defied conventional understanding of spacecraft design. These massive organisms traveled through the void without engines in the traditional sense, propelling themselves through mechanisms Imperial tech priests could not adequately explain. The ships ranged in size from small drone ships barely larger than fighter craft to massive hive ships kilometers in length that served as mobile genetic factories and troop carriers. Their hulls consisted of chitinous armor plates that could regenerate damage, and they bristled with weapons that launched living ammunition. Acid-spewing beetles, razor-sharp projectiles grown in specialized organs, and boarding torpedoes filled with warrior organisms ready to tear through bulkheads and slaughter crew members. The fleet's assault on Imperial worlds followed a methodical pattern refined over countless invasions in other galaxies. Initial waves of spore mines drifted through orbital space, living bombs that detonated when they detected ships or stations, clearing approach vectors for the main bioships. Mycetic spores rained down on planetary surfaces, organic drop pods that split open to disgorge Tyranid warrior organisms bred for specific combat roles. Hormagaunts swarmed forward in living waves, their scything talons ripping through defensive lines through sheer numbers. Termagants provided ranged support with living weapons that fired flesh-boring beetles. Larger organisms like carnifexes smashed through fortifications, their massive bulk shrugging off weapons fire that would destroy tanks. The Tyranid ground assault doctrine relied on overwhelming numerical superiority and perfect coordination. Every organism connected to the hive mind, a gestalt consciousness that directed the swarm with intelligence that adapted to enemy tactics in real time. Tyranid forces displayed none of the confusion or hesitation that affected conventional armies. They attacked weak points, concentrated forces at critical junctures, and sacrificed lesser organisms without hesitation to achieve objectives. Imperial defenders found themselves facing an enemy that learned from every engagement, that adapted its approach based on observed weaknesses, and that never rooted or retreated unless the hive mind calculated that preservation of biomass served its larger strategic goals. Hive fleet behemoths' path through the Eastern Fringe left dozens of worlds as lifeless husks. The fleet consumed everything: human populations, native wildlife, plant life, even the microorganisms in the soil and water. Specialized organisms called rippers, small six-legged creatures with massive jaws, swarmed across conquered worlds in numbers that defied counting, devouring every scrap of organic matter they encountered and dragging it to digestion pools where the biomass was broken down and absorbed by the fleet. The Tyranids left nothing behind that could sustain life, transforming verdant worlds into dead rocks in a matter of weeks. The defense of Macragge represented humanity's first major victory against the Tyranid threat and established tactical doctrines that would guide anti-Tyranid operations for centuries. Hive fleet behemoths' approach to the Ultramar system triggered every alarm and defense protocol the Ultramarines had established over 10 millennia. The chapter recalled forces from deployments across the Eastern Fringe, assembled the Ultramar Defense Auxilia, and prepared the orbital defenses for the largest battle the system had faced since the Horus Heresy. Chapter Master Marnius-Kage assumed overall command of the defense, coordinating between Space Marine forces, Imperial Navy vessels, and planetary defense forces with the methodical efficiency that characterized Ultramarines' operations. The void battle above Macragge developed into a grinding engagement where Imperial ships traded broadsides with bioships at ranges where both sides could inflict maximum damage. Imperial Navy captains learned quickly that Tyranid vessels could absorb tremendous punishment before dying, their organic hulls regenerating damage between engagements. The bioships responded to Imperial tactics with disturbing speed, adjusting their approach vectors and weapon deployments to counter observed patterns. The battle cost the Imperial Navy dozens of vessels, including several capital ships that were overwhelmed by boarding organisms that tore through their interiors, but the defenders managed to destroy enough bioships to prevent the Tyranids from achieving orbital supremacy. The ground campaign on Macragge itself tested the Ultramarines as they had not been tested since the Heresy. Tyranid organisms made planetfall across the northern polar regions, the same harsh terrain where Robot Guilliman had been found as an infant. The initial landings established beachheads that expanded rapidly as more spores descended, and the organisms began consuming local biomass to fuel their advance. Ultramarines companies deployed to contain the invasion faced enemies that attacked in waves that seemed endless, each assault learning from the previous one's failures and probing new approaches to break through defensive lines. Marnius-Kage led the defense personally, his tactical genius matching against the hive mind's alien intelligence in a contest that would determine the fate of Ultramar. The chapter master recognized that conventional defensive tactics would eventually fail against an enemy that could simply overwhelm positions through numerical superiority. Instead, he implemented a strategy of aggressive counterattacks targeting the larger synapse creatures that coordinated Tyranid forces. Without these command organisms, lesser creatures reverted to instinctive behavior, losing the coordination that made them so dangerous. Ultramarine strike forces, often led by Kage himself, penetrated deep into Tyranid-held territory to hunt and kill these priority targets. The climactic engagement occurred when Kage led a Terminator squad assault against a Tyranid bioship that had crash-landed on Macreg's surface and was serving as a coordination nexus for ground forces. The Ultramarines fought through kilometers of organic corridors filled with warrior organisms, their storm bolters and power fists carving a path toward the ship's central chamber. There, Kage faced a creature that Imperial xenobiologists would later classify as a swarmlord, one of the hive mind's most sophisticated command organisms. The duel between the chapter master and the swarmlord lasted hours, with both combatants sustaining injuries that would have killed lesser beings. Kage ultimately prevailed, though he lost all 4 limbs in the process and required extensive bionic reconstruction that left him more machine than man. The destruction of the swarmlord and the elimination of multiple synapse creatures disrupted Tyranid coordination across the entire Macreg theater. Lesser organisms began attacking without the hive mind's guiding intelligence, allowing Ultramarines' forces to defeat them piecemeal. The remaining bioships in orbit, having suffered catastrophic losses and apparently calculating that the invasion had failed, withdrew from the system. The Ultramarines had won, but the cost proved severe. The chapter suffered casualties that would take decades to replace, entire companies reduced to handfuls of survivors. The planet Macreg bore scars that would never fully heal, regions of the polar zones left as contaminated dead zones where Tyranid spores still lurked in the frozen soil. Hive Fleet Kraken approached the galaxy from a different vector than Behemoth, its invasion beginning in the 992nd year of the 41st millennium. Where Behemoth had struck as a unified force, Kraken demonstrated a more sophisticated strategy, splitting into multiple splinter fleets that attacked across a vast front. This approach prevented the Imperium from concentrating forces against a single invasion corridor and forced defenders to spread their resources across dozens of threatened sectors. The hive mind had learned from Behemoth's defeat, adapting its approach to counter the mass defense strategy that had proven effective at Macreg. The fall of Ikar IV demonstrated the refined horror of Kraken's invasion methodology. The hive world's population of billions should have provided enough defenders to hold against any conventional invasion, but the Tyranids had seeded the world with genostealer cults generations before the main fleet arrived. When Kraken's vanguard organisms entered the system, the cults rose up simultaneously across every major hive city. They sabotaged defensive installations, assassinated military commanders, and opened gates to allow Tyranid organisms direct access to population centers. The planetary defense forces found themselves fighting enemies on every front, unable to establish coherent defensive lines, while cultists attacked from within and Tyranid organisms assaulted from without. The Ultramarines responded to Ikar IV's distress calls, deploying multiple companies to attempt a relief operation. The Space Marines discovered a situation far worse than initial reports suggested. The genostealer infestation had penetrated every level of Ikar IV society, from the underhive gangs to the planetary governor's own household. Trust broke down completely as defenders could not determine who remained loyal and who served the alien infiltrators. The Ultramarines fought building to building battles through hive cities where every civilian might be a cultist. Every defender might turn on their comrades at any moment. The chapter managed to evacuate some loyal elements of the population, but Ikar IV itself fell to the Tyranids, its billions of citizens providing biomass that fueled Kraken's continued expansion. Craftworld Eandon, one of the great Eldari craftworlds that had survived the fall, encountered a Kraken splinter fleet in the void between stars. The Tyranids detected the craftworld's massive psychic presence and diverted forces to consume it, seeing the concentrated biomass of millions of Eldari as an irresistible target. The resulting battle tested the craftworld's defenders to their absolute limits. Eandon's warriors deployed every asset they possessed, from guardian militias to aspect warriors to the ancient war machines of the Wraith constructs. The craftworld's fleet engaged the bioships in running battles that lasted weeks, both sides suffering losses that neither could easily replace. The Tyranids breached Eandon's hull in multiple locations, forcing the Eldari to fight boarding actions within their own craftworld. Hormagaunts and Genestealers rampaged through corridors that had stood inviolate for 10,000 years, slaughtering civilians and desecrating sacred sites. The Eldari responded with desperate ferocity, knowing that defeat meant not just death, but the extinction of their craftworld's entire culture and history. They deployed Wraith Guards, the animated remains of their ancestors piloted by spirit stones, in numbers that would normally be considered sacrilege. The dead rose to defend the living, ancient warriors fighting one final battle to preserve their descendants. Eandon survived the Tyranid assault, but the victory came at a cost that crippled the craftworld for centuries. More than 3/4 of the population died in the fighting, leaving vast sections of the craftworld empty and silent. The survivors found themselves outnumbered by their own dead, the spirit stones of the fallen exceeding the living population by orders of magnitude. Eandon became known as the craftworld of the dead, its armies consisting primarily of wraith constructs animated by the souls of those who fell defending their home. The psychological impact of this transformation affected every aspect of Eandon's culture, creating a society haunted by loss and dependent on their ancestors' continued service even in death. The sides of the Emperor chapter faced annihilation when Kraken splinter fleets converged on their recruiting worlds in the Sawtek system. The chapter had been operating at reduced strength, with most companies deployed on campaigns throughout the Eastern Fringe when the Tyranids attacked. The Space Marines on their homeworld of Sotha mounted a desperate defense, but the numbers arrayed against them exceeded anything they could reasonably resist. The Tyranids landed in such density that the ground itself disappeared beneath a living carpet of organisms that flowed across the landscape like a tide of chitin and teeth. Chapter Master Thorsira led the defense from the Fortress Monastery, coordinating the handful of companies available, and the chapter's fleet assets in a battle he knew could not be won. The Scythes fought with the desperation of Space Marines watching their legacy die, each battle brother accounting for hundreds of Tyranid organisms before falling. The chapter's fleet attempted to evacuate gene seed stocks and relics, but most were lost when bioships overwhelmed the extraction vessels. Sotha fell completely, consumed by the Tyranids along with the chapter's entire recruiting population and most of their equipment and facilities. The surviving sides of the Emperor, reduced to less than 200 battle brothers scattered across the Eastern Fringe, found themselves a chapter without a home. They continued fighting as a fleet-based force, their hatred of the Tyranids driving them to seek out splinter fleets wherever they could be found. The chapter's tactics evolved to focus on anti-Tyranid operations exclusively, developing specialized equipment and doctrines for fighting the Xenos organisms. They painted their armor green to honor their lost homeworld and adopted new heraldry that reflected their status as the last survivors of a destroyed chapter. The Scythes became experts in hunting Tyranid synapse creatures, their experience teaching them to identify and eliminate the command organisms that coordinated the swarms. Kraken splinter fleets continue to plague the Eastern Fringe centuries after the main invasion. The hive mind strategy of dispersal proved devastatingly effective, creating dozens of independent threats that the Imperium must track and combat separately. Some splinter fleets have grown to significant size by consuming minor worlds and building their numbers, while others remain small but dangerous, striking at isolated colonies and disappearing back into the void before Imperial forces can respond. The Ordo Xenos maintains tracking stations throughout the Eastern Fringe, attempting to monitor splinter fleet movements, but the Tyranids' ability to travel through deep space without conventional engines makes them difficult to detect until they enter a system and begin their assault. Hive Fleet Leviathan represented a threat of unprecedented scale when it approached the galaxy from below the galactic plane in the closing years of the 41st millennium. The fleet's size dwarfed both Behemoth and Kraken combined, its bioships numbering in the millions and stretching across light years of space. Imperial observers who detected Leviathan's approach initially refused to believe their sensor readings, unable to accept that a single organism or group of organisms could achieve such massive scale. The hive mind had apparently been gathering strength in the intergalactic void, consuming whatever biomass it encountered and building its numbers for an invasion that would dwarf all previous attempts. Leviathan's approach vector brought it into contact with Imperial space across a vast front that stretched from the Eastern Fringe through the southern reaches of the Segmentum Ultima and into the Segmentum Tempestus. The fleet split into multiple tendrils, each one larger than Behemoth had been, that struck at different regions simultaneously. The Imperium found itself facing a coordinated assault on dozens of sectors, with Tyranid organisms making planetfall on hundreds of worlds within weeks of each other. The scale of the invasion overwhelmed local defense forces and required the deployment of crusade-level assets to multiple theaters simultaneously. The Cryptus campaign developed when a major Leviathan tendril pushed toward the Cryptus system, a region containing several densely populated Imperial worlds. The Blood Angels chapter responded to the threat, deploying their full strength along with successor chapters, including the Flesh Terrors and Angels in Carmine. The Space Marines established defensive positions on key worlds, preparing to face the Tyranid assault with the fury and skill that had made the Blood Angels legendary throughout the Imperium. The campaign developed into a series of brutal engagements where Space Marines fought against overwhelming numbers of Tyranid organisms in battles that tested their gene seed's legendary resilience. The Shield of Baal became the focal point of Leviathan's assault in the region when the hive mind apparently identified the Blood Angels' homeworld of Baal as a priority target. The tendril approaching Baal contained bioships in such numbers that they blotted out stars as they advanced, their psychic presence creating a shadow in the warp that isolated the entire sector. Chapter Master Dante, the oldest living space marine outside of Dreadnought internment, assumed command of the defense. He coordinated between multiple Blood Angels successor chapters, Imperial Guard regiments, and the local defense forces of worlds throughout the Baal system, in preparation for the largest battle the chapter had faced since the Horus Heresy. The Tyranids attacked the outer worlds of the Baal system first, consuming the populations and using the biomass to fuel their advance toward Baal itself. The defenders fought delaying actions on each world, making the Tyranids pay for every meter of ground in Space Marine and Guard blood. The battles demonstrated the full horror of Tyranid assault doctrine, with waves of organisms attacking without pause, learning from each repulsed assault and adapting their approach. Baal's two moons, Baal Prime and Baal Secundus, fell to the Tyranids despite desperate defenses, their populations consumed and their surfaces transformed into organic processing centers where biomass was rendered down and absorbed into the fleet. The final defense of Baal itself saw the Blood Angels and their successors fighting from the walls of their fortress monastery, the bodies of Tyranid organisms piling so high that later waves used the corpses as ramps to reach the walls. Dante led from the front despite his advanced age, his ancient armor and the Ax Mortalis cutting through Tyranid warriors with precision born of 1,500 years of combat experience. The chapter deployed every asset they possessed, from Baal predators to Death Company squads, whose black rage turned them into whirlwinds of destruction that even the Tyranids struggled to contain. The battle reached a point where defeat seemed inevitable, the defenders reduced to their last ammunition, and the Tyranids still coming in endless waves. The arrival of the Great Rift and the subsequent warp storms it generated saved Baal through cosmic coincidence rather than any Imperial strategy. The warp storms swept through the Baal system with devastating force, their energies anathema to the Tyranid organism's connection to the hive mind. Bioships died in orbit as the warp energies overwhelmed their biological systems. Ground forces lost coordination and began attacking each other or simply dying as their connection to the guiding intelligence was severed. The Blood Angels, nearly dead on their feet, watched in amazement as their enemies collapsed around them. The victory came at tremendous cost, with the chapter reduced to a fraction of its strength and Baal's surface left scarred and partially consumed, but they had survived. The Octarius War began as an inquisitorial stratagem that has since spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control or predict. Inquisitor Kryptman of the Ordo Xenos, one of the Imperium's foremost experts on the Tyranid threat, conceived a plan to redirect Hive Fleet Leviathan into the Octarius sector, where the Orc Empire of the Overfiend of Octarius held sway. Kryptman's reasoning was coldly logical. The Orcs represented a major threat to Imperial space in their own right, and the Tyranids would inevitably consume countless Imperial worlds as they advanced. By manipulating Leviathans advanced through careful destruction of potential food sources and the placement of attractant pheromones, Kryptman guided the Hive fleet directly into Orc-held space. The Segmentum Ultima contains some of the most strategically significant worlds in the Imperium, ranging from the fortress monasteries of legendary space marine chapters to forge worlds that supply entire crusade fleets with equipment and materiel. These planets form the backbone of Imperial power in the Eastern Fringe, each contributing unique resources or capabilities that the wider Imperium depends upon for its continued survival. Understanding these worlds and their roles provides insight into how the Segmentum functions as both an administrative unit and a theater of constant warfare. Baal occupies a position of profound importance as the homeworld of the Blood Angels chapter and their Primarch Sanguinius. The system sits in the Segmentum Ultima's reaches, a relatively isolated location that has shaped the chapter's character and recruitment practices for 10 millennia. The primary world of Baal itself presents a harsh environment, its surface scoured by ancient wars that left much of the planet a radioactive wasteland. 2 moons orbit Baal, designated Baal Prime and Baal Secundus, both of which play crucial roles in the chapter's operations and recruitment. The entire system bears the marks of catastrophic conflict from humanity's distant past, with theories suggesting that dark age of technology weapons devastated these worlds during Old Night. Baal Prime maintains a slightly more hospitable environment than its parent world, though this remains a relative assessment. The moon's surface contains regions of irradiated desert interspersed with areas where hardy vegetation manages to survive despite the background radiation that permeates the soil and water. Human populations on Baal Prime live in tribal communities that struggle for survival in an environment that kills the weak and hardens those who survive to adulthood. These tribes war amongst themselves for control of water sources and the mutant creatures that provide food, creating a culture where combat skills and physical resilience determine status and survival. Baal Secundus presents an even harsher environment, its surface almost entirely covered by radioactive deserts, where daytime temperatures reach levels that would kill unprotected humans within hours. The moon's human inhabitants, driven underground by the hostile surface conditions, dwell in cave systems and ancient ruins that provide shelter from both the heat and the radiation. These populations have adapted to their environment over countless generations, developing resistance to radiation levels that would prove fatal to humans from more hospitable worlds. The tribes of Baal Secundus fight for survival against mutant predators and each other, their existence a constant battle against an environment actively hostile to human life. The Blood Angels recruit exclusively from the populations of Baal, Baal Prime, and Baal Secundus, drawing aspirants from the tribes that demonstrate the physical and mental qualities necessary to survive the transformation into Space Marines. The chapter's recruitment practices involve trials that test potential initiates to their absolute limits, filtering for individuals who possess not just physical strength, but the mental fortitude to endure the gene seed implantation process. The harsh conditions on the moons serve as a natural selection mechanism, ensuring that only the strongest and most adaptable individuals reach the age where they might be considered for recruitment. Those who survive their youth in Baal's irradiated wastelands have already proven themselves capable of enduring hardship that would break lesser men. the fortress monastery of the Blood Angels dominates a region of Baal's surface, a massive complex that has stood for 10,000 years and serves as both the chapter's headquarters and a monument to their Primarch's legacy. The fortress, known as the Arx Angelicum, rises from the desert in a cluster of towers and walls that incorporate both functional military architecture and artistic elements, reflecting the Blood Angels' appreciation for beauty and craftsmanship. The structure contains everything necessary for a Space Marine chapter's operations: training facilities where neophytes learn the arts of war, armories stocked with weapons accumulated over millennia, libraries preserving the chapter's history and tactical doctrines, and the sacred chambers where gene seed is stored and new Space Marines are created. Within the Fortress Monastery, the Hall of Sanguinius serves as the chapter's most sacred space. This chamber houses relics of the Primarch, including fragments of his armor and weapons he wielded during the Great Crusade. The Blood Angels maintain the hall as a place of contemplation and remembrance, where battle brothers can reflect on their Primarch's sacrifice during the final battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The chamber's walls bear the names of every Blood Angel who has fallen in service to the Emperor, a roll of honor that stretches back to the chapter's founding and grows with each passing century. The Red Thirst and the Black Rage, genetic flaws that afflict all sons of Sanguinius, cast a shadow over the Blood Angels and their recruitment practices. The Red Thirst manifests as an overwhelming desire to drink the blood of enemies, a flaw that the chapter manages through discipline and ritual, but can never fully eliminate. The Black Rage proves even more dangerous, a psychic echo of Sanguinius's death that can overwhelm a Space Marine's consciousness and trap them in a vision where they relive their Primarch's final moments. Battle brothers who fall to the Black Rage become Death Company, warriors who fight with suicidal fury until they fall in battle. The chapter maintains facilities within the Fortress Monastery specifically for managing these afflictions, though no cure has ever been found despite 10,000 years of effort. The forge worlds of the Adeptus Mechanicus scattered throughout the Segmentum Ultima provide the manufacturing capacity necessary to equip the Imperial war machine. These planets operate under the authority of Mars rather than the Administratum, their tech priest populations dedicated to the production of weapons, vehicles, and equipment according to standard template construct patterns preserved since the Dark Age of technology. The Forge worlds represent concentrations of technological knowledge and industrial capacity that cannot be easily replaced, making them priority targets for enemies of the Imperium and requiring substantial defensive assets to protect. Metallica ranks among the most productive Forge worlds in the Segmentum Ultima, its manufactorums operating continuously to produce tanks, artillery pieces, and small arms for Imperial forces throughout the Eastern Fringe. The world's surface has been completely transformed by millennia of industrial development, with every square kilometer covered by factories, refineries, and the massive hive structures that house the tech priest population and their servitor workforce. The atmosphere contains such high concentrations of industrial pollutants that unprotected humans would die within minutes of exposure, though the tech priests have long since replaced their lungs with augmetic systems that filter the toxic air or eliminate the need for breathing entirely. The Metallican tech priests have developed a reputation for military expertise that extends beyond simple manufacturing. The Forge world maintains its own Skidari legions, cybernetically enhanced soldiers who serve as the Mechanicus's military arm. These forces have fought in countless campaigns throughout the Segmentum Ultima, their augmented bodies and sophisticated weapons making them formidable opponents. Metallica's Skidari favor aggressive tactics that leverage their technological advantages, using rad weapons to irradiate enemy positions and galvanic rifles to deliver devastating volleys of electrical energy that can disable vehicles and kill infantry with equal efficiency. Griffon 4 served as one of the Segmentum's most important Forge worlds until its destruction during the 13th Black Crusade and the subsequent Tyranid invasions. The world's loss represents a strategic blow that the Imperium continues to feel decades later. Griffon 4 specialized in the production of Titan-grade weapons and the plasma reactors that power these god machines, capabilities that required specific knowledge and facilities that existed nowhere else in the Segmentum. The Forge World's tech priests had maintained their expertise through an unbroken chain of knowledge transfer, stretching back to the dark age of technology, each generation of adepts learning from their predecessors and adding their own innovations to the accumulated wisdom. The fall of Griffon IV to Hive Fleet Leviathan occurred despite desperate defense efforts by the Forge World's Skidari legions and supporting Imperial forces. The Tyranids attacked in numbers that overwhelmed the defenders, their bioships landing organisms faster than the defenders could eliminate them. The tech priests fought with the cold logic that characterized their kind, calculating odds and deploying assets according to tactical algorithms that should have maximized their chances of survival. The hive mind proved adaptable enough to counter these strategies, adjusting its approach to exploit weaknesses in the defense and concentrating forces at critical points. The final transmissions from Griffon IV described Tyranid organisms breaching the central manufactorum complexes and beginning the systematic consumption of the Forge World's population and infrastructure. The loss of Griffon IV's production capacity created immediate problems for Titan legions throughout the Segmentum Ultima. Legio Griffonicus, the Forge World's primary Titan legion, survived the planet's fall by virtue of having most of its god machines deployed on campaigns elsewhere when the Tyranids attacked. The legion found itself without a home base, its tech priests and support personnel scattered across multiple systems. The surviving Griffon IV tech priests have attempted to preserve their specialized knowledge, establishing smaller facilities on other Forge Worlds and training new generations of adepts in the Lost World's techniques. However, the infrastructure and accumulated expertise of millennia cannot be quickly replaced, and the Imperium's ability to maintain and repair its Titan legions has suffered accordingly. The hive worlds scattered throughout the Segmentum Ultima serve as concentrations of human population that provide both industrial labor and military manpower. These planets feature massive city structures called hives that rise kilometers into the atmosphere and extend deep underground, housing billions of citizens in conditions that range from relative comfort in the upper levels to grinding poverty in the underhive depths. The hive worlds produce finished goods in their manufactorums, process raw materials shipped from mining worlds, and serve as administrative centers for their surrounding systems. Their populations provide the bulk of Imperial Guard regiments raised from the Segmentum, with each hive world expected to meet regular tithes of soldiers for service throughout the Imperium. Quintarn functions as both a hive world and one of the original worlds of Ultramar, giving it dual significance within the Segmentum's hierarchy. The planet's hives produce industrial output that supplies Ultramar's military forces while maintaining the higher standards of governance and quality of life that characterize Guilliman's realm. Quintarn's population enjoys better working conditions and more reliable food supplies than equivalent citizens on hive worlds outside Ultramar, a practical demonstration of how Guilliman's administrative philosophies translate into measurable improvements in daily life. The world contributes regiments to the Ultramar Defense Auxilia that receive training and equipment superior to standard Imperial Guard formations, reflecting the resources available within the 500 worlds. Ajax, known throughout the Imperium as the Garden of Ultramar, represents an unusual example of a world that combines agricultural production with strategic importance. The planet's surface features carefully maintained ecosystems where crops grow in abundance, providing food surpluses that help feed Ultramar's population and reduce dependence on imports from outside the realm. Ajax's reputation as a garden world made it a symbol of Ultramar's prosperity and the benefits of rational governance, a planet where human civilization existed in harmony with natural systems rather than consuming and destroying them. The world's beauty attracted pilgrims and visitors from across the Eastern Fringe, individuals who wished to see proof that the Imperium could create and maintain environments worth living in rather than simply exploiting worlds until they became uninhabitable. The Plague Wars brought devastation to Ajax, when Death Guard forces invaded the world as part of Mortarian's campaign against his brother Guilliman's realm. The Chaos Space Marines deployed biological weapons that transformed Ajax's pristine environment into a nightmare of disease and corruption. Nurgle's plagues spread across the planet's surface, killing crops and infecting the population with diseases that defied conventional treatment. The Garden World's forests rotted, its rivers became streams of toxic sludge, and its cities filled with the sick and dying. The Death Guard established fortified positions across Ajax, using the world as a staging ground for further attacks into Ultramar, while Nurgle demons cavorted through the ruins of what had been the realm's most beautiful planet. The liberation of Ajax required a massive military effort led by Guilliman himself, who could not allow such a symbolic world to remain in Chaos hands. Ultramarines forces supported by elements from multiple other chapters assaulted the Death Guard positions in battles that combined conventional warfare with spiritual struggle against Nurgle's corruption. The fighting dragged on for months as Imperial forces cleared the planet section by section, purging Chaos taint and eliminating Death Guard holdouts. The campaign succeeded in reclaiming Ajax, but the world's recovery will take decades or centuries. Large regions remain too contaminated for human habitation, and the planet's agricultural output has been reduced to a fraction of its previous levels. Ajax survived, but bears scars that serve as a reminder of how quickly Chaos can destroy what took millennia to build. Satha occupies a unique position in Imperial history as the location of the Pharos device, an ancient Xenotech artifact of unknown origin that played a crucial role during the Horus Heresy. The device, discovered in the depths beneath Satha's surface, possessed the ability to generate a beam of light that could be seen across vast interstellar distances, functioning as a beacon for navigation when the Astronomican's light was blocked by warp storms. The Ultramarines used the Pharos to coordinate fleet movements during the Heresy, maintaining communication and navigation capabilities when other legions found themselves isolated by the warp's turbulence. The device's origins remain mysterious, with theories suggesting it might be Necron technology, though no definitive evidence supports this hypothesis. The Pharos device's destruction occurred during the Heresy when Night Lord's forces attacked Satha in an attempt to deny the Ultramarines access to its capabilities. The resulting battle saw the device overload and explode, releasing energies that devastated the surrounding region and killed everyone in the immediate vicinity. Some Imperial scholars have theorized that the Pharos' destruction sent a signal across the intergalactic void, potentially attracting the attention of the Tyranid hive fleets that would later invade the galaxy. This theory remains unproven, but the timing of the Tyranids' arrival centuries after the Pharos' destruction has led some to suggest a connection between the two events. The Death Worlds and Feral Worlds scattered throughout the Segmentum Ultima serve as recruitment grounds for various Space Marine chapters, their harsh environments producing populations with the physical and mental characteristics that make suitable aspirants. Death Worlds feature ecosystems actively hostile to human life, with predators, environmental hazards, and extreme conditions that kill the weak and forge survivors into hardened warriors. Feral Worlds maintain human populations at pre-industrial technology levels, their inhabitants living as tribal warriors whose existence revolves around constant struggle for survival. Both planet types provide Space Marine chapters with recruits who have already proven themselves capable of enduring hardship and violence before they ever begin the transformation into Astartes. The Space Wolves recruit from Fenris, though this world actually sits within the Segmentum Solar rather than Ultima, contrary to some misconceptions about its location. The confusion likely stems from the chapter's frequent deployments into the Eastern Fringe and their participation in campaigns throughout the Segmentum Ultima. The actual recruitment worlds used by chapters based in the Segmentum Ultima vary widely in their characteristics and cultures, each producing aspirants with distinct qualities that influence the chapter's character and combat doctrines. The Dark Angels maintain recruitment operations on several worlds throughout the Segmentum, though their primary Fortress Monastery of the Rock operates as a mobile space station rather than being tied to a specific planet. The chapter's secretive nature extends to their recruitment practices, with few outside the chapter knowing the exact locations of all their recruiting worlds. The Dark Angels select aspirants who demonstrate not just physical capability, but also the mental discipline and capacity for secrecy that the chapter values. Potential recruits undergo extensive psychological evaluation to ensure they possess the temperament necessary to keep the chapter's secrets, particularly regarding the Fallen and the events of the Horus Heresy that the Dark Angels work to conceal from the wider Imperium. The recruitment practices across the Segmentum's various chapters follow similar broad patterns, while incorporating specific variations that reflect each chapter's traditions and requirements. Aspirants typically come from populations between the ages of 10 and 14, young enough that their bodies can accept the gene seed implants, but old enough to have developed the physical and mental foundations necessary for the transformation. The selection trials test candidates to their limits and beyond, with mortality rates often exceeding 90%. Those who survive the trials then face the implantation process itself, a series of surgical procedures that introduce 19 specialized organs derived from the chapter's Primarch's gene seed. Each implant carries risks of rejection or complications that can kill the aspirant or leave them crippled and unable to complete the transformation. The Forge Worlds, Hive Worlds, and recruitment planets of the Segmentum Ultima form an interconnected network that sustains Imperial power in the Eastern Fringe, despite constant threats from Xenos invasions, chaos incursions, and internal instability. The loss of any major world in this network creates ripple effects that impact military operations and civilian populations across multiple sectors. The Imperium's ability to maintain control over these strategic assets while simultaneously defending them against enemies who recognize their importance represents an ongoing challenge that requires constant vigilance and the commitment of substantial military resources. The worlds described here represent only the most significant examples of the thousands of planets that contribute to the Segmentum's defense and administration, each playing their role in humanity's struggle for survival in a galaxy that offers no mercy to the weak or unprepared. The Segmentum Ultima hosts a greater concentration of space marine chapters than any other region of the Imperium save the Segmentum Solar itself. This density of Adeptus Astartes' presence reflects both the strategic importance of the Eastern Fringe and the historical patterns of chapter deployment that date back to the second founding following the Horus Heresy. The Ultramarines and their successor chapters dominate the region numerically, a legacy of Robout Guilliman's influence and the fact that Ultramar itself sits within the Segmentum's borders. However, chapters descended from other Primarchs maintain significant presences throughout the region, each bringing their own combat doctrines, traditions, and approaches to the endless war for humanity's survival. The Novamarines exemplify the Ultramarines' successor chapters in their strict adherence to the Codex Astartes and their methodical approach to warfare. Based on their homeworld of Honorum in the Segmentum's northern reaches, the Novamarines have maintained an exemplary record of service since their founding in the second founding. The chapter's battle brothers paint their armor in quartered patterns of blue and white, a heraldry that announces their Ultramarines' heritage while establishing their distinct identity. The Novamarines interpret the Codex Astartes not as a rigid set of unchangeable rules, but as a comprehensive tactical guide that provides solutions to virtually any combat situation if studied with sufficient depth and understanding. The chapter's fortress monastery on Honorum incorporates extensive libraries where battle brothers study both the Codex and historical records of campaigns dating back to the Great Crusade. Novamarines officers spend decades analyzing tactical situations, comparing historical precedents, and developing their understanding of how Guilliman's principles apply to different combat scenarios. This scholarly approach produces commanders who can rapidly assess battlefield conditions and implement appropriate Codex-approved responses with minimal delay. The Novamarines have participated in numerous campaigns throughout the Segmentum Ultima, often serving alongside their Ultramarines progenitors in operations that require precise coordination between multiple chapter elements. The Genesis chapter operates from their homeworld of Newfound in the Segmentum's eastern regions, maintaining a reputation for strict discipline and unwavering loyalty to Imperial authority. The chapter takes its name from their role as one of the first successor chapters created during the Second Founding, representing a new genesis for the Ultramarines' Legion's genetic legacy. Genesis chapter battle brothers undergo extensive training in both individual combat skills and squad-level tactics that emphasize the mutual support and coordinated fire that characterize Codex-compliant operations. The chapter maintains particularly strong ties to the Ultramarines, regularly participating in joint operations and exchanging officers for training purposes that ensure both chapters benefit from shared tactical knowledge. The Genesis chapter's heraldry features white armor with red trim, a color scheme that distinguishes them clearly on the battlefield while maintaining visual connections to their Ultramarines' heritage through the use of blue on company markings and other details. The chapter has fought against virtually every enemy of the Imperium during their 10,000-year history, from orc wayags to chaos incursions to Tyranid invasions. Their battle honors include participation in the defense of Ultramar against multiple threats and campaigns throughout the Eastern Fringe that pushed back Xeno's invasions, threatening Imperial territory. The Genesis chapter's commanders have earned recognition from the Ultramarines chapter masters for their tactical acumen and their ability to implement Codex doctrines, effectively even in situations that deviate from standard combat scenarios. The Scythes of the Emperor faced near extinction when Hive Fleet Kraken devastated their homeworld of Sotha and consumed their recruiting populations. The chapter had been operating at reduced strength when the Tyranids attacked, with most companies deployed on campaigns throughout the Eastern Fringe. The few battle brothers present on Sotha fought desperately to defend their fortress monastery and the civilian populations that provided the chapter's recruitment base, but the numbers arrayed against them exceeded anything they could reasonably resist. Chapter Master Thorsira coordinated the defense, knowing that survival represented the best possible outcome, with victory against such overwhelming Tyranid forces being an impossibility. The fall of Sotha left the Scythes of the Emperor scattered across the Segmentum Ultima, with fewer than 200 battle brothers surviving from what had been a chapter of roughly 1,000 warriors. The survivors found themselves without a homeworld, without recruiting populations, and without the infrastructure necessary to rebuild their numbers through normal means. The chapter could have been declared extinct and their remaining battle brothers absorbed into other chapters, but the Scythes refused to accept such a fate. They reorganized as a fleet-based chapter, their remaining vessels serving as mobile bases from which they conducted operations against Tyranid splinter fleets wherever they could be found. The Scythes of the Emperor adopted new heraldry following Sotha's destruction, painting their armor green to honor their lost homeworld's forests and adopting imagery that reflected their status as survivors of catastrophe. The chapter's tactics evolved to focus specifically on anti-Tyranid operations, with battle brothers developing expertise in identifying and eliminating synapse creatures that coordinated Tyranid swarms. Scythes of the Emperor forces learned to operate in small units that could infiltrate Tyranid-held territory, strike at high-value targets, and extract before the swarm could respond in force. This approach maximized the impact of their limited numbers while avoiding the pitched battles that would result in unsustainable casualties for a chapter that could not easily replace losses. The chapter's situation improved somewhat with the arrival of Primaris reinforcements during the Indomitus Crusade. Robout Guilliman recognized the Scythes of the Emperor's plight and assigned them a significant allocation of Primaris Space Marines to rebuild their strength. These reinforcements brought the chapter back to combat effectiveness, though integrating the Primaris Marines into a chapter culture shaped by loss and focused on revenge against the Tyranids' created challenges. The traditional Scythes viewed the Primaris as untested warriors who had not earned their place through the same trials and losses that the survivors had endured. The Primaris Marines, for their part, found themselves joining a chapter with traditions and tactical doctrines that differed significantly from the standard codex, approaches they had been trained to implement. The Blood Angels maintained their fortress monastery on Baal within the Segmentum Ultima, serving as the progenitors for numerous successor chapters that share both their gene seed and the genetic flaws that afflict all sons of Sanguinius. The Blood Angels' presence in the Segmentum extends beyond their own chapter through these successors, creating a network of related chapters that often coordinate operations and provide mutual support when facing threats too large for individual chapters to handle alone. The shared burden of the Red Thirst and the Black Rage creates bonds between Blood Angels' successors that transcend the normal relationships between chapters, as only those who carry Sanguinius's gene seed truly understand the constant struggle against the flaws embedded in their genetic legacy. The Angels in Carmine trace their lineage directly to the Blood Angels Legion, their founding during the Second Founding establishing them as one of the oldest successor chapters. Based on their fortress monastery on the world of Incarmine, the chapter maintains the Blood Angels' traditions of combining martial excellence with appreciation for art and beauty. Angels in Carmine Battle Brothers paint their armor in deep red, similar to their progenitors, but with gold trim that distinguishes their heraldry. The chapter has fought in countless campaigns throughout the Segmentum Ultima, their assault troops earning particular recognition for their effectiveness in close-quarters combat, where the Red Thirst can be channeled into devastating aggression against the Emperor's enemies. The Angels in Carmine manage the Black Rage through practices similar to those employed by the Blood Angels themselves. Battle Brothers who succumb to the psychic echo of Sanguinius's death join the chapter's death company, warriors painted in black armor, adorned with red crosses who fight with suicidal fury until they fall in battle. The chapter maintains chaplains specifically trained to minister to the death company, guiding these lost brothers toward the enemy and ensuring their final battles serve the Emperor's purposes. The Angels in Carmine view service in the death company not as a curse, but as a final opportunity for glory, a chance to die fighting as their Primarch died defending the Emperor aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The Angels Sanguine operate with a level of secrecy unusual even among Space Marine chapters, their fortress monastery's location remaining unknown to most Imperial authorities. The chapter's Battle Brothers paint their armor in black rather than red, a choice that reflects their somber approach to their duties and their focus on the darker aspects of their gene seed's legacy. The Angels Sanguine struggle with the Red Thirst more severely than many other Blood Angels successors, their Battle Brothers constantly fighting the urge to drain their enemy's blood in the heat of combat. This internal struggle has led the chapter to develop extensive meditation practices and psychological conditioning techniques meant to help Battle Brothers maintain control even when the thirst threatens to overwhelm their discipline. The chapter's secretive nature extends to their combat operations, with the Angels Sanguine preferring to strike from unexpected directions and withdraw before enemy forces can organize effective responses. They excel at infiltration operations and surgical strikes against high-value targets, their black armor providing natural camouflage in the darkness where they prefer to operate. The Angels Sanguine maintain limited contact with other chapters, including their Blood Angels progenitors, appearing when needed for major campaigns, but otherwise conducting their operations independently. This isolation has led to speculation about the chapter's true condition and whether they struggle with their gene seeds' flaws more severely than they admit to outside observers. The Space Wolves maintain no permanent presence in the Segmentum Ultima, their fortress monastery of the Fang being located on Fenris in the Segmentum Solar. However, the chapter regularly deploys great companies on extended campaigns throughout the Eastern Fringe, their fleet-based operations allowing them to respond to threats across vast distances. Space Wolves forces operating in the Segmentum Ultima function as independent battle groups under the command of Wolf Lords who exercise considerable autonomy in selecting targets and conducting operations. These expeditionary fleets have participated in campaigns against orcs, Tyranids, and chaos forces throughout the region, their aggressive tactics and preference for close combat making them particularly effective in boarding actions and urban warfare. The Space Wolves' divergence from Codex Astartes' organization creates friction when they operate alongside Codex-compliant chapters. Space Wolves' great companies function as combined arms forces that include everything from scouts to heavy armor, rather than specializing in specific combat roles as Codex companies do. This organizational structure allows Space Wolves' forces to operate independently without requiring support from other companies, but it complicates coordination with chapters that expect standard Codex organization and terminology. Space Wolves commanders refer to their squads as packs and use titles like Long Fangs for heavy weapons specialists rather than the standard Devastator designation, differences that seem trivial but can cause confusion during joint operations where precise communication proves critical. The Mantis warriors endure a penitent crusade in the Segmentum Ultima as punishment for their participation in the Badab War on the side of the Astral Claws. The chapter's involvement in that conflict stemmed from legitimate grievances about tithes and Imperial administration in the Maelstrom Zone, but their decision to support Lugged Huron's rebellion against Imperial authority resulted in their designation as excommunicate treacherous. The Mantis warriors eventually abandoned Huron's cause when they recognized the extent of his corruption and his willingness to employ chaos-tainted allies, but this belated loyalty could not erase their earlier treachery. The Inquisition and the High Lords of Terra debated whether to destroy the chapter entirely or offer them a chance at redemption through service. The penitent crusade imposed on the Mantis warriors requires them to conduct operations in the Segmentum Ultima's most dangerous regions for a period of 100 years, during which time they must fight without hope of reinforcement or resupply from Imperial authorities. The chapter operates from their battle barge praying Mantidae, having abandoned their homeworld of Oathika as part of their penance. Mantis warriors' forces specialize in stealth operations and ambush tactics, their gene seed derived from the White Scars giving them an affinity for rapid strikes and mobile warfare. The chapter's battle brothers paint their armor in green and white, colors that allow them to blend into various environments while maintaining their distinct identity. The Penitent Crusade has tested the Mantis warriors' resolve and combat effectiveness repeatedly over the decades since the Badab War's conclusion. The chapter has fought against Orc invasions in the Segmentum's northern reaches, conducted boarding actions against Chaos vessels emerging from warp storms, and participated in operations against Tyranid splinter fleets that threatened isolated Imperial worlds. These campaigns have cost the chapter heavily, with casualties mounting and no possibility of recruiting new battle brothers until their penance is complete. The Mantis warriors accept these losses as necessary payment for their earlier betrayal, viewing each fallen brother as a sacrifice that brings the chapter closer to redemption and eventual restoration to full Imperial favor. The Marines errant operate from their fortress monastery on the world of Villamis, conducting operations throughout the Segmentum Ultima that emphasize mobile warfare and rapid response to emerging threats. The chapter's name reflects their preference for ranging far from their homeworld on extended campaigns rather than maintaining static defensive positions. Marines errant forces organize around fast-moving strike forces built around bike squaddies, land speeders, and rhino-mounted tactical squads that can deploy quickly and redeploy as battlefield conditions change. This tactical doctrine makes the chapter particularly effective at responding to threats across multiple systems, as their forces can conduct operations on one world and then rapidly transition to another theater without requiring extensive logistical preparation. The Marines errant maintain a reputation for independence that occasionally brings them into conflict with Imperial authorities, who expect Space Marine chapters to coordinate their operations with broader strategic planning. The chapter's commanders argue that their effectiveness depends on maintaining operational flexibility and responding to threats as they emerge rather than following predetermined campaign schedules that may become obsolete before they can be implemented. This tension between independence and coordination reflects broader debates within the Adeptus Astartes about how Space Marine chapters should relate to other Imperial institutions, and whether their status as the Emperor's finest warriors grants them authority to make strategic decisions without outside oversight. The arrival of Primaris Space Marines through the Indomitus Crusade fundamentally altered the composition and capabilities of chapters throughout the Segmentum Ultima. Archmagos Belisarius Call had spent 10,000 years developing improved space marine biology and equipment under a secret commission from Robot Guilliman before the heresy. The Primaris Marines that resulted from this work possessed enhanced physical capabilities, additional organs beyond the standard 19, and access to new weapons and armor patterns that exceeded the performance of equipment that regular space marines had used for millennia. Guilliman deployed these Primaris reinforcements across the Imperium during the Indomitus Crusade, providing struggling chapters with desperately needed manpower, while simultaneously introducing warriors whose very existence challenged 10,000 years of tradition. The integration of Primaris Marines into existing chapters created challenges that varied depending on each chapter's culture and circumstances. Chapters that had suffered severe losses, like the Scythes of the Emperor, generally welcomed the Primaris reinforcements as salvation that allowed them to continue functioning as effective military forces. Other chapters viewed the Primaris with suspicion, questioning whether these new warriors truly understood the traditions and combat doctrines that had served for 10 millennia. The fact that Primaris Marines had been created in Call's laboratories, rather than recruited and trained through each chapter's established practices, raised questions about their loyalty, and whether they could truly be considered full members of their assigned chapters. The Ultima founding created entirely new chapters composed exclusively of Primaris Marines, these formations bearing the gene seed of the original legions, but lacking the accumulated history and traditions of older chapters. Guilliman established these new chapters to address critical gaps in the Imperium's defenses and to garrison regions that had been left vulnerable by the opening of the Great Rift. The Ultima founding chapters in the Segmentum Ultima received assignments to sectors that had lost their defending chapters to Tyranid invasions or chaos incursions, their fresh manpower and modern equipment providing capabilities that devastated regions desperately needed. The Rift Stalkers, an Ultima founding chapter, established their base of operations near the Cicatrix Maledictum's edge in the Segmentum Ultima, conducting operations against chaos forces that emerged from the Great Rift to raid Imperial territory. The chapter's battle brothers wear gray armor marked with red trim, colors chosen to reflect their role as hunters operating in the Twilight regions, where reality frays and the warp's influence grows strong. Rift Stalkers' forces specialize in rapid response operations, deploying via Overlord gunships and repulsor grav tanks that allow them to reach threatened areas quickly and engage chaos forces before they can establish strong positions. The chapter has fought numerous engagements against Chaos Space Marine warbands and demon incursions, their Primaris equipment and tactics proving effective against enemies that had previously overwhelmed conventional Imperial forces. The integration challenges faced by traditional chapters receiving Primaris reinforcements manifested in various ways, depending on each chapter's specific circumstances and culture. The Ultramarines and their Codex-compliant successors generally integrated Primaris Marines relatively smoothly, as the new warriors had been trained in doctrines that aligned closely with Codex principles. The Blood Angels and their successors faced more complex integration issues due to questions about whether Primaris Marines experienced the Red Thirst and Black Rage with the same intensity as traditional battle brothers. Initial observations suggested that Primaris Marines might be more resistant to these genetic flaws, though whether this represented a true improvement or simply delayed onset of symptoms remained unclear. The practical advantages of Primaris Marines in combat situations quickly became apparent to chapters that deployed them alongside traditional battle brothers. Primaris Marines stood taller and stronger than their predecessors, their enhanced physiology allowing them to wear the heavier Mk-10 power armor and wield weapons like bolt rifles that combine the range of standard bolt guns with improved armor penetration. Intercessor squads provided more effective fire support than tactical squads equipped with standard bolters, their bolt rifles killing targets at ranges where traditional space marines would struggle to achieve lethal hits. Hellblaster squads armed with plasma incinerators delivered devastating firepower against heavily armored targets, though the weapon's tendency to overheat and potentially kill their wielders reminded everyone that increased capability came with corresponding risks. The establishment of new chapters and the reinforcement of existing ones through Primaris deployments represented the largest expansion of Space Marine numbers since the second founding. The Segmentum Ultima received a significant portion of these reinforcements due to its strategic importance and the severe losses many chapters in the region had suffered during the Tyranid invasions and other conflicts. This influx of new warriors provided the Imperium with capabilities it desperately needed to hold territory and conduct offensive operations, but it also created tensions within the Adeptus Astartes as traditional and Primaris Marines learned to work together despite their differences in training, equipment, and perspective on what it meant to serve as one of the Emperor's Angels of Death. The resurrection of Robot Guilliman on Macragge in the final years of the 41st millennium represented a turning point in Imperial history, comparable in significance to the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne 10,000 years earlier. The Primarch had lain in stasis within the Temple of Correction since his wounding by the demon Primarch Fulgrim during the heresy, his body preserved in a stasis field that prevented his death but offered no path to recovery. The Ultramarines had maintained their vigil over their Gene Father for 10 millennia, hoping against all evidence that some miracle might restore him to life and leadership. That miracle arrived in the form of an alliance so unlikely that many observers initially dismissed reports of it as enemy propaganda or mass delusion. The Unari, followers of the newly awakened Eldari god Unid, approached the Ultramarines with an offer that should have resulted in their immediate execution as Xenos intruders. Ivrain, the prophet of Unid and leader of this radical Eldari faction, claimed she possessed the ability to heal Guilliman and restore him to full function. The Ultramarines' initial response combined outrage at the Xenos' presence within their fortress monastery with desperate hope that the claim might prove true. The chapter's leadership faced an impossible decision: trust ancient enemies offering salvation, or maintain their vigil over a Primarch who showed no signs of ever awakening through conventional means. Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call arrived on Macragge with his own contribution to Guilliman's potential resurrection. The tech priest had spent 10,000 years working on projects commissioned by Guilliman himself before the heresy, including the development of the Primaris Space Marines and the Armor of Fate, a suit of artificer armor incorporating technology that pushed the boundaries of what the Adeptus Mechanicus considered acceptable innovation. Call's presence added another layer of complexity to an already unprecedented situation, as his methods and willingness to experiment with technology that others considered heretical made him a controversial figure even within the Mechanicus. The combination of Eldari sorcery and Mechanicus technology represented a collaboration that violated virtually every Imperial doctrine regarding proper relations with Xenos and appropriate use of ancient knowledge. The actual process of Guilliman's resurrection involved Ivrain channeling the power of Unid to heal the Primarch's wounds, while Call's Armor of Fate provided life support and augmentation that stabilized Guilliman's biology as it transitioned from stasis to active function. The procedure succeeded, though the exact mechanisms involved remained subjects of intense debate among those few individuals with knowledge of the event. Guilliman awakened to find himself in an Imperium vastly different from the one he had left behind, a civilization that had transformed his father's vision of secular enlightenment into a theocratic nightmare, where the Emperor was worshipped as a god and superstition had replaced reason as the foundation of governance. The Primarch's initial reaction to the state of the Imperium combined horror at how far humanity had fallen with pragmatic recognition that he lacked the luxury of attempting to reform 10,000 years of accumulated dysfunction, while existential threats pressed from all sides. Guilliman found the Imperial cult particularly disturbing, as it represented everything the Emperor had fought against during the Great Crusade. The idea that his father, who had explicitly rejected divinity, and worked to eliminate religious thinking from human civilization, was now worshipped as a god by trillions of faithful struck Guilliman as a perversion of everything the Imperium was supposed to represent. However, he recognized that the faith of billions provided one of the few forces holding the Imperium together, and attempting to dismantle it would likely cause more damage than maintaining the uncomfortable status quo. The Terran Crusade assembled rapidly as Guilliman organized forces for the journey to Holy Terra. The Primarch understood that his legitimacy as Lord Commander of the Imperium required recognition from the High Lords of Terra, and more importantly, an audience with the Emperor himself. The Crusade fleet gathered ships from across Ultramar and the surrounding sectors, incorporating Ultramarines forces, Imperial Navy vessels, Adeptus Mechanicus support elements, and contingents from other Space Marine chapters that pledged their strength to Guilliman's banner. The fleet's composition reflected the desperate circumstances of the era, with many vessels showing battle damage from recent engagements and crews operating at reduced strength due to casualties that could not be quickly replaced. The journey from Macragge to Terra required navigating through a galaxy that had become significantly more dangerous than it had been before Guilliman's wounding. Warp storms disrupted traditional routes, forcing the fleet to take longer paths and make multiple short jumps rather than the direct transits that would have been possible in more stable times. The fleet encountered threats throughout the voyage, from Chaos warships emerging from warp rifts to Orc raiders seeking valuable targets. Each engagement delayed the Crusade's progress and cost ships and personnel that could not be easily replaced, but Guilliman drove the fleet forward with relentless determination. The Primarch's presence aboard the flagship Macragge's honor provided a rallying point for Imperial forces throughout the journey, as word spread that a son of the Emperor walked among humanity once more. The arrival of the Terran Crusade at Holy Terra created immediate political complications, alongside the celebration of Guilliman's return. The High Lords of Terra had governed the Imperium for 10 millennia without direct oversight from anyone who could claim authority exceeding their own. The sudden appearance of a Primarch, a being who had walked alongside the Emperor during the Great Crusade, and who possessed legal authority as Lord Commander that superseded their own positions, threatened to overturn the careful balance of power that had developed over centuries. Some High Lords welcomed Guilliman's return as salvation for an Imperium teetering on the edge of collapse. Others viewed him as a threat to their authority and began maneuvering to limit his influence or undermine his legitimacy. Guilliman's audience with the Emperor in the throne room of the Imperial Palace remains one of the most significant and mysterious events in recent Imperial history. The Primarch entered the throne room alone, spending hours in the presence of his father, while the Adeptus Custodes maintained their eternal vigil and prevented anyone else from entering. What passed between father and son in that chamber remains unknown, as Guilliman has never spoken publicly about the encounter in detail. Those who observed him emerging from the throne room reported that the Primarch appeared shaken in a way that battlefields had never managed to achieve, his expression suggesting he had experienced something that fundamentally altered his understanding of his father and the Imperium's situation. The political maneuvering that followed Guilliman's meeting with the Emperor resulted in a restructuring of the High Lords of Terra that removed several individuals who had proven themselves incompetent or corrupt. The Primarch exercised his authority as Lord Commander to dismiss High Lords who had failed in their duties or who opposed necessary reforms, replacing them with individuals he judged more capable of managing the Imperium's institutions during the crisis. This purge of the High Lords demonstrated Guilliman's willingness to use his authority decisively, though it also created enemies among those who lost power or who feared they might be next. The Primarch balanced this display of authority with careful respect for Imperial institutions, making clear that he intended to work within existing structures rather than dismantling them entirely. The launch of the Indomitus Crusade represented the largest coordinated military operation the Imperium had mounted since the Great Crusade itself. Guilliman organized the Crusade with the systematic efficiency that had characterized his leadership during the heresy, dividing available forces into multiple fleet groups that would pursue different strategic objectives across the galaxy. The Crusades' primary goals included relieving besieged worlds, reclaiming territory lost to enemy forces, establishing new defensive networks, and deploying the Primaris Space Marines that Belisarius Cawl had created over 10 millennia. The scale of the operation required coordination between the Adeptus Astartes, Imperial Navy, Astra Militarum, Adeptus Mechanicus, and various other Imperial institutions, a level of cooperation that had become increasingly rare in the fragmented Imperium of the late 41st millennium. The Crusade organized into multiple fleet groups designated by number and assigned specific operational zones. Fleet Primus, commanded by Guilliman himself, would strike toward the Segmentum Obscurus and the regions most heavily affected by the 13th Black Crusade's aftermath. Fleet Secundus received orders to push into the Segmentum Pacificus, reclaiming worlds that had fallen to chaos or Xeno's invasion. Fleet Tertius would operate in the Segmentum Tempestus, while Fleet Quartus received assignment to the Segmentum Ultima, where it would work to stabilize the Eastern Fringe and relieve pressure on Ultramar. Additional fleet groups received specialized missions targeting specific threats or strategic objectives that required dedicated forces to achieve. The deployment of Primaris Space Marines through the Indomitus Crusade fundamentally altered the composition of the Adeptus Astartes across the Imperium. Cawl had created these enhanced warriors in secret, maintaining genetic stocks from all the loyal Primarchs and producing Primaris Marines in massive numbers. The Crusade fleets carried these warriors to chapters throughout the galaxy, providing reinforcements to formations that had suffered catastrophic losses and creating entirely new chapters through the Ultima founding. The Primaris Marines brought with them new equipment patterns, including bolt rifles, plasma incinerators, and grav tanks that represented the first significant advances in space marine wargear in millennia. Their enhanced physiology and improved equipment made them more effective combatants than traditional space marines, though their lack of experience and different training created integration challenges. Fleet Quartus arrived in the Segmentum Ultima to find the region in a state of crisis that exceeded even the dire reports that had reached Terra. The opening of the Great Rift had severed communication with vast swathes of Imperial territory, leaving worlds isolated and vulnerable to attack. Tyranid splinter fleets continued their predations across the Eastern Fringe, consuming worlds that lacked the forces to mount effective defenses. Tau expansion had accelerated during the Imperium's moment of weakness, with water-caste diplomats offering Imperial populations alternatives to their current governance, while fire-caste warriors stood ready to enforce Tau authority over worlds that accepted their offers. Orc-Wyags had erupted across multiple sectors, the Greenskins sensing weakness and gathering in numbers that threatened to overwhelm local defense forces. The Plague Wars in Ultramar demanded immediate attention from Fleet Quartus and from Guilliman himself once he completed his initial objectives in other regions. Mortarion had led his Death Guard Legion in an invasion of his brother's realm, seeking to corrupt the 500 worlds and demonstrate the superiority of Nurgle's gifts over Guilliman's rigid adherence to order and efficiency. The Death Guard deployed biological weapons that transformed entire worlds into disease-ridden hellscapes where normal humans could not survive without extensive protective equipment. Nurgle demons manifested across Ultramar's worlds, their presence in real space sustained by the despair and suffering of populations watching their homes transform into nightmares of rot and decay. The defense of Ultramar required coordinating multiple space marine chapters, Imperial Guard regiments, and the Ultramar Defense Auxilia in operations across dozens of worlds simultaneously. Guilliman assumed personal command of the campaign, his strategic genius matching against Mortarion's 10,000 years of experience waging war in the Eye of Terror. The Primarch's conflict extended beyond simple military operations into a philosophical struggle between two visions of humanity's future. Mortarion offered the cold comfort of Nurgle's embrace, where suffering ended through acceptance of decay and the abandonment of feudal resistance against entropy. Guilliman countered with humanity's capacity for reason, organization, and the refusal to surrender to despair regardless of how dire circumstances became. The liberation of individual worlds from Death Guard control required specialized tactics that conventional Imperial forces struggled to implement effectively. Death Guard Plague Marines proved nearly impossible to kill through conventional means, their bodies sustained by Nurgle's blessings, and capable of continuing to fight despite injuries that would kill normal Chaos Space Marines. The biological weapons they deployed persisted in environments long after the Death Guard forces had moved on, requiring extensive decontamination operations that consumed resources and manpower desperately needed for combat operations. Nurgle demons added another layer of complexity, as their presence required sanctioned psychers or Grey Knights to banish them permanently rather than simply driving them back into the warp. The Battle of Ixalan represented the Plague War's climactic engagement, with Guilliman leading a massive assault to reclaim the Garden of Ultramar from Death Guard occupation. The world's symbolic importance made it a priority target for both sides, as Ixalan's fall had demonstrated Chaos's ability to corrupt even Ultramar's most beautiful worlds. The Death Guard had fortified their positions extensively, using the planet's transformed landscape to their advantage, and deploying demon engines that combined Mechanicus technology with warp-spawned entities. The Imperial assault required coordinating multiple strike forces that hit Death Guard positions simultaneously, preventing Mortarian's forces from concentrating their strength against any single threat. Guilliman's confrontation with Mortarion on Ixalan's surface brought the two Primarchs into direct combat for the first time since the Heresy. The duel lasted hours, with both combatants wielding weapons and abilities that could devastate entire armies. Mortarion's Scythe's silence carried plagues that could kill with the slightest touch, while his sorcerous powers called forth Nurgle's gifts to sustain him and weaken his brother. Guilliman fought with the Emperor's sword, a blade that burned with flames anathema to chaos and capable of permanently destroying demon princes. The Primarch of the Ultramarines also wore the armor of fate, which provided protection and enhanced his already superhuman capabilities to levels that allowed him to match his corrupted brother's demonic strength. The duel ended not with Mortarion's death, but with his banishment back to the warp, the Emperor's sword inflicting wounds that even Nurgle's power could not immediately heal. The Demon Primarch's departure disrupted Death Guard coordination across Ixalan, allowing Imperial forces to press their advantage and eliminate the remaining Chaos Space Marines in a series of brutal engagements. The victory came at tremendous cost, with thousands of Imperial Guard dead, several Space Marine companies reduced to a handful of survivors, and Ixalan itself left scarred by corruption that would take decades to fully cleanse. However, the symbolic importance of reclaiming the Garden of Ultramar and driving Mortarion from the field provided a morale boost that extended far beyond the immediate military significance. The reorganization of Battlefleet Ultima proceeded alongside active combat operations, as Guilliman recognized that military victories alone could not secure the Segmentum without functional naval forces to maintain control of space. The Imperial Navy in the Segmentum Ultima had suffered severe losses during the Tyranid invasions and Chaos incursions that preceded the Indomitus Crusade, with entire battle groups destroyed and shipyards damaged or captured. The Primarch implemented reforms that emphasized coordination between naval elements and ground forces, establishing protocols that ensured fleet assets supported planetary operations rather than operating independently according to their own strategic priorities. The deployment of new ship classes through the Crusade provided Battlefleet Ultima with capabilities it had previously lacked. The Overlord-class battlecruisers combined heavy firepower with improved speed and maneuverability compared to older designs, allowing them to engage enemy capital ships while maintaining the flexibility to respond to emerging threats. The Astrius-class super heavy tanks and repulsor grav tanks deployed with Primaris forces required specialized transport vessels capable of delivering them to planetary surfaces, leading to the development of new landing ship designs that could carry these vehicles and their supporting infantry. The establishment of new defensive networks across the Segmentum Ultima focused on creating mutually supporting strongpoints that could resist enemy attacks and serve as bases for counteroffensive operations. Guilliman's strategic planning emphasized defense in depth, with multiple layers of fortified worlds positioned to delay enemy advances and provide Imperial forces with opportunities to mass for counterattacks. This approach required significant investment in fortification construction and the deployment of garrison forces to man these defensive positions, resources that had to be balanced against the need for mobile strike forces capable of responding to threats across the Segmentum. The political ramifications of Guilliman's return extended throughout the Segmentum Ultima's governance structures. The Primarch's authority as Lord Commander gave him power to override local officials and restructure administrative systems that had proven inefficient or corrupt. Planetary governors who had ruled their worlds as personal fiefdoms found themselves subject to audits and oversight that many had avoided for centuries. The Adeptus Administratum's bureaucratic processes, which had evolved over 10 millennia into Byzantine systems that often hindered rather than helped imperial governance, faced systematic review and reform where Guilliman's authority could reach. The ecclesiarchy's response to Guilliman's return mixed genuine religious fervor with political calculation about how a living Primarch's presence affected their authority. The Imperial cult had spent 10,000 years teaching that the Emperor was divine and that his sons were saints who served as intermediaries between humanity and the divine. Guilliman's resurrection and his clear discomfort with being worshipped created theological complications that various ecclesiarchy factions interpreted differently. Some viewed the Primarch's return as proof of the Emperor's divinity and his continued intervention in human affairs. Others worried that Guilliman's secular worldview threatened the faith that held the Imperium together. The integration of Primaris Marines into existing chapters continued throughout the Indomitus Crusade as Fleet Quartus delivered reinforcements to formations across the Segmentum Ultima. The Nova Marines received several companies of Primaris Marines that integrated relatively smoothly due to the chapter's strict adherence to Codex doctrine. The Blood Angels and their successors faced more complex integration challenges, with questions about whether Primaris Marines experienced the Red Thirst and Black Rage requiring careful observation over time. The sides of the Emperor's situation improved dramatically with the arrival of Primaris reinforcements that brought them back to functional strength after their near destruction by Hive Fleet Kraken. The creation of new chapters through the Ultima founding provided the Segmentum Ultima with fresh forces untainted by losses or compromises that older chapters had accumulated over millennia of warfare. These new formations received assignments to sectors that had lost their defending chapters or that required additional Space Marine presence to maintain security. The Rift Stalkers established themselves near the Great Rift's edge, conducting operations against Chaos forces emerging from the warp. The Void Tridents received assignment to patrol routes threatened by various Xenos raiders, their fleet-based operations allowing them to respond quickly to threats across multiple systems. The Indomitus Crusade's operations in the Segmentum Ultima continued for years, with fleet groups conducting campaigns across the Eastern Fringe, while Guilliman coordinated overall strategy from Ultramar when not personally leading critical operations. The Crusade relieved besieged Hive worlds that had held out against Chaos or Xenos sieges through sheer determination and the faith that the Imperium would eventually send help. It reclaimed Forge worlds that had fallen to enemy control, restoring their production capacity to Imperial service. It established new fortress worlds at strategic locations, garrisoning them with sufficient forces to resist enemy attacks and serve as bases for future operations. The Wordbearer's Legion maintains an obsessive focus on Ultramar that extends far beyond simple military strategy or territorial ambition. This hatred stems directly from events during the Great Crusade when the Emperor ordered the Ultramarines to make an example of the Wordbearer's religious devotion. The city of Monarchia on the world of Kur had been transformed by the Wordbearers into a monument to the Emperor's divinity, its architecture and culture reflecting Lorgar's belief that humanity's master deserved worship as a god. The Emperor's response demonstrated his absolute rejection of such veneration. He dispatched the Ultramarines to Kur with orders to raze Monarchia completely, reducing the city to rubble and ash, while the Word-Bearers' Legion watched from orbit, forced to witness the destruction of their greatest work. The humiliation went beyond mere destruction of property. Guilliman ordered the entire Word-Bearers' Legion to kneel in the ruins of Monarchia, while the Emperor himself manifested to rebuke Lorgar for his failures. The Primarch of the Word-Bearers and his sons knelt in the dust and ash of their demolished city, compelled to acknowledge their supposed transgression, while Ultramarines stood guard around them. This public shaming before their brother Legion inflicted psychological wounds that never healed. Lorgar's subsequent turn to chaos worship and his orchestration of the Horus Heresy grew directly from this moment, his faith redirected from the Emperor to the Chaos Gods who welcomed his devotion rather than rejecting it. The betrayal at Calth represented the Word-Bearers' revenge for Monarchia, though the scale of treachery exceeded anything that could be justified as simple retaliation. Corferon led Word-Bearers' forces in a surprise attack on Ultramarines gathered at Calth for what they believed would be a joint muster. The Word-Bearers opened fire without warning, their ships targeting Ultramarines' vessels, while ground forces that had been welcomed as allies revealed their corruption and began slaughtering their supposed brothers. The attack included deployment of a weapon that damaged Calth's sun, causing it to emit deadly radiation that scoured the planet's surface and forced survivors underground. The Word-Bearers' assault killed tens of thousands of Ultramarines and millions of civilian inhabitants, inflicting casualties on Guilliman's Legion that took decades to replace. The Word-Bearers never forgave the Ultramarines for Monarchia, and the Ultramarines never forgot Calth. This mutual hatred has persisted for 10,000 years, manifesting in raids and counter-raids that continue into the present era. Word-Bearers' warbands operating from the Eye of Terror and other chaos-held regions regularly launch attacks into Ultramar's territory, seeking to inflict damage on worlds under Guilliman's protection. These operations range from small-scale raids by individual companies to major invasions involving multiple warbands coordinated by Dark Apostles who preach that destroying Ultramar serves the Chaos God's will while simultaneously avenging ancient grievances. The Word-Bearers' tactical approach to operations in Ultramar emphasizes corruption and desecration over simple conquest. Their Dark Apostles work to establish chaos cults on Imperial worlds, spreading the worship of the ruinous powers through careful infiltration and manipulation of local populations. These cults remain hidden for years or decades, growing in strength and influence until they can support a full Word-Bearers invasion. When the Traitor Legion attacks, the cults rise up to sabotage defenses and open gates to their masters, creating internal threats that Imperial defenders must address while simultaneously fighting the external assault. The Word-Bearers view this approach as spiritually significant rather than merely tactically effective, seeing the corruption of Imperial citizens as an act of worship that pleases the Chaos Gods. The demon summoning that Word-Bearers sorcerers practice with disturbing proficiency adds another dimension to their threat. The Legion's embrace of chaos worship during the heresy included extensive study of demonology and the rituals necessary to tear holes in reality and allow warp entities to manifest in real space. Word-Bearers' invasions frequently include mass summoning rituals where Dark Apostles and their possessed followers call forth demons to fight alongside the Traitor Marines. These entities range from lesser demons like Bloodletters and Plaguebearers to greater demons whose presence can devastate entire battlefields. The Word-Bearers coordinate their mortal forces with these demonic allies, using the warp-spawned entities to break defensive lines or eliminate specific targets, while Chaos Space Marines exploit the resulting chaos. The Alpha Legion operates throughout the Segmentum Ultima in ways that make their true objectives and force disposition nearly impossible to determine with certainty. This legion distinguished itself during the Great Crusade through its emphasis on infiltration, misdirection, and unconventional warfare that prioritized achieving objectives through subterfuge rather than direct assault. The Alpha Legion's methods proved effective during the Crusade, with the twin Primarchs Alpharius and Omgon leading operations that destabilized enemy governments, turned allies against each other, and created conditions where Imperial forces could achieve victory with minimal casualties. The Legion's betrayal during the heresy shocked those who had worked alongside them, as their true allegiance remained unclear even to other traitor legions. The Alpha Legion's ambiguous objectives continue to confound Imperial intelligence services 10,000 years after the heresy. Unlike other traitor legions whose goals can be understood even if not predicted, the Alpha Legion conducts operations that sometimes appear to serve Chaos interests, sometimes seem to advance Imperial goals, and frequently accomplish purposes that remain unclear to outside observers. Alpha Legion cells have been documented fighting against Imperial forces in some sectors, while apparently working to undermine other Chaos forces elsewhere. This pattern has led to theories that the Legion maintains a secret agenda known only to its highest-ranking members, possibly related to information they received from the Cabal, a Xenos organization that approached them before the heresy. The infiltration networks that the Alpha Legion maintains across the Segmentum Ultima represent perhaps their most dangerous capability. The Legion specializes in creating sleeper cells that remain dormant for years or decades, their members living as ordinary Imperial citizens while awaiting activation orders. These infiltrators include Alpha Legion operatives who have undergone extensive surgery and conditioning to pass as normal humans, cultists who serve the Legion without fully understanding its true nature, and corrupted Imperial officials who provide intelligence and access in exchange for promises of power or survival. The networks operate with cellular structure where individual members know only their immediate contacts, making it nearly impossible to eliminate an entire network even when Imperial authorities discover and purge specific cells. The Alpha Legion's confirmed operations throughout Imperial space demonstrate their continued effectiveness despite the fragmentation that has affected other traitor legions. They have conducted assassinations of Imperial officials whose deaths destabilized regional governments, allowing Chaos forces to exploit the resulting power vacuums. They have stolen gene seed stocks from Space Marine chapters, though what they do with this genetic material remains unclear. They have sabotaged Imperial military operations by providing false intelligence or corrupting supply chains, causing campaigns to fail without the defenders ever realizing they faced internal subversion rather than simple bad luck. The Legion's operatives have infiltrated Imperial Guard regiments, planetary defense forces, and even Space Marine chapters in some documented cases, though the full extent of their penetration remains unknown. The difficulty of combating Alpha Legion operations stems from the challenge of identifying their operatives and distinguishing their activities from normal Imperial dysfunction. When a supply convoy fails to arrive, is it because Alpha Legion saboteurs destroyed it, or simply because of the Administratum's legendary inefficiency? When intelligence proves inaccurate, does it reflect Alpha Legion manipulation, or the normal problems with gathering reliable information across interstellar distances? The Inquisition devotes substantial resources to hunting Alpha Legion cells, but the operative's skill at maintaining cover and the Legion's willingness to sacrifice exposed cells to protect larger networks make this a frustrating and often futile effort. Renegade chapters represent a different category of chaos threat than the original traitor legions, these being Space Marine formations that turned from the Emperor's service after the heresy rather than during it. The reasons for these betrayals vary widely, from gradual corruption by chaos influence to sudden catastrophic events that shattered a chapter's loyalty. Some renegade chapters maintain organizational cohesion and continue operating much as they did before their fall, while others fragment into warbands that bear little resemblance to their origins as disciplined Space Marine formations. The Imperium treats all renegades as equally treacherous regardless of the circumstances that led to their betrayal, hunting them with the same determination applied to the original traitor legions. The Crimson Slaughter emerged from the loyalist chapter known as the Crimson Sabers, a formation that served the Imperium faithfully for millennia before their fall. The chapter's corruption began during a campaign to purge a world infected by chaos taint, where they conducted extensive executions of populations suspected of harboring cultists. The Crimson Sabers believed they were performing their duty by eliminating potential corruption, but the scale of the killings and the inclusion of many innocent citizens among the dead created a psychic backlash. The chapter's battle brothers began experiencing visions of their victims, hearing the voices of those they had killed, accusing them of murder and demanding vengeance. These visions grew more intense over time, driving the Crimson Sabers to increasingly desperate measures to silence the voices. The transformation into the Crimson Slaughter occurred as the chapter sought relief from their torment through chaos worship, believing that pledging themselves to the ruinous powers would grant them peace. The opposite occurred. The voices grew stronger, and the chapter discovered that only through killing could they temporarily silence their victims' accusations. This realization drove the Crimson Slaughter into a spiral of violence, where they conducted raids and attacks specifically to generate fresh corpses, the act of killing providing brief respite from the psychological torture that defined their existence. The chapter's armor transformed to reflect their corruption, their original crimson and white heraldry darkening to deep red and black, while their equipment developed organic growths and mutations that marked them as servants of chaos. The Crimson Slaughter operates primarily in the Segmentum Obscurus, but conducts raids into the Segmentum Ultima when opportunities present themselves, or when the voices driving them demand it. Their attacks focus on generating maximum casualties rather than achieving strategic objectives, with the chapter's battle brothers slaughtering defenders and civilians alike in frenzied assaults. The Crimson Slaughter has developed a reputation for particular brutality even by Chaos Space Marine standards, their need to kill overriding any tactical consideration or self-preservation instinct. Imperial forces that encounter them report facing enemies who fight with suicidal aggression, accepting casualties that would cause other Chaos forces to withdraw because the temporary relief from their torment outweighs concerns about survival. The Violators represent another example of a chapter that fell to Chaos corruption, though their specific circumstances differ from the Crimson Slaughter's psychological torture. The Violators embraced Slaanesh worship, their pursuit of perfection in combat gradually transforming into obsession with sensation and excess. The chapter's fall occurred over an extended period rather than through a single catastrophic event, with individual battle brothers succumbing to temptation and gradually corrupting their brothers through shared experiences and the insidious influence of Slaanesh's gifts. By the time the chapter's leadership recognized the extent of the corruption, it had spread too far to contain. The Violators abandoned their homeworld and fled into the Eye of Terror rather than face Imperial justice. The Violators conduct raids throughout the Segmentum Ultima and other regions, seeking experiences that satisfy their corrupted desires. Their attacks target worlds where they can inflict maximum suffering and indulge in the excesses that Slaanesh worship encourages. The chapter's battle brothers have undergone extensive mutations that reflect their patron god's influence, with some developing additional limbs or sensory organs, while others transform into creatures that barely resemble their original forms. The Violators employ sonic weapons and other equipment that reflects Slaanesh's association with sensation and sound, using these tools to inflict pain and terror on their victims, while experiencing the pleasure that their corruption has taught them to derive from others' suffering. The impact of the Great Rift on Chaos incursions throughout the Segmentum Ultima cannot be overstated. The massive warp storm that tore across the galaxy created conditions that favor Chaos forces in multiple ways. The warp's increased turbulence makes it easier for demons to manifest in real space, with the barrier between dimensions weakened to the point where summoning rituals that previously required extensive preparation can now be conducted with relative ease. The shadow and the warp effect that Tyranid hive minds generate has been partially countered by the Great Rift's presence, as the ambient warp energy provides Chaos Psychers with power that helps them resist the Tyranids' psychic suppression. The disruption to Imperial communication and coordination has created opportunities for Chaos forces to attack isolated worlds that lacked the support they would have received before the rift's opening. The Plague Wars represented the most significant chaos invasion of the Segmentum Ultima in the wake of the Great Rift's formation. Mortarion led his Death Guard Legion in an assault on Ultramar that sought to corrupt Guilliman's realm and demonstrate Nurgle's power over the Primarch's devotion to order and reason. The Death Guard deployed biological weapons on a scale that transformed entire worlds, their plague ships spreading diseases that killed billions and mutated survivors into creatures that served Nurgle's purposes. The invasion included support from Nurgle demon armies, with plaguebearers and Nurglings manifesting across Ultramar's worlds, while Great Unclean Ones led assaults on major population centers. Kagath Plaguefather's invasions of Ultramar operated in coordination with Mortarion's broader campaign, but focused on specific objectives related to the greater demon's obsession with creating the perfect plague. Kagath, a great unclean one who fell from Nurgle's cauldron and has spent millennia attempting to recreate the disease he accidentally consumed, views Ultramar's population as ideal test subjects for his experiments. The demon's forces attacked worlds across the realm, deploying experimental plagues designed to produce specific symptoms or spread through particular vectors. Kagath personally led some of these invasions, his massive bulk wading through Imperial defensive lines, while his Nurglings and Plaguebearer servants spread his latest creations among the defenders. The Death Guard's tactics during the Plague Wars emphasized attrition and corruption over rapid conquest. Their Plague Marines advanced slowly, but inexorably, their bodies sustained by Nurgle's blessings allowing them to absorb damage that would kill normal Chaos Space Marines. The biological weapons they deployed persisted in environments long after the Death Guard moved on, creating zones of contamination that required extensive resources to cleanse. Imperial forces attempting to reclaim worlds from Death Guard control found themselves fighting not just against Chaos Space Marines, but against the environment itself, as every surface might be contaminated with diseases that could kill through the slightest contact. The demon engines that the Death Guard deployed added mobile firepower and psychological impact to their invasions. These constructs combined chaos-corrupted vehicles with bound demons, creating war machines that operated according to malevolent intelligence rather than simple programming. Plagueburst crawlers advanced alongside Plague Marine infantry, their mortars launching shells filled with virulent diseases that exploded over Imperial positions and infected everyone in the blast radius. Mephitic blight haulers scuttled across battlefields on insected legs, their weapons spraying toxic chemicals, while the demons bound within their hulls laughed at the suffering they caused. The resistance that Ultramar's defenders mounted against the Plague Wars required coordination between multiple military forces and the deployment of specialized equipment capable of operating in contaminated environments. Ultramarines and their successor chapters led the defense, their power armor providing protection against biological weapons that would kill unaugmented humans. The Ultramar Defense Auxilia, deployed in sealed environment suits when operating in heavily contaminated zones, though these provided imperfect protection and soldiers still died from diseases that found ways through seals or overwhelmed filtration systems. The Adeptus Mechanicus contributed Skidara forces, whose augmetic bodies proved more resistant to biological weapons than normal human physiology, though even they struggled against plagues specifically designed to corrupt machine components. The reclamation of worlds from Death Guard control required not just military victory, but extensive decontamination operations that continued long after the last Chaos Space Marine had been killed or driven off. Specialized teams worked to identify contaminated areas and implement purification protocols that ranged from chemical treatments to simple incineration of infected zones. Some worlds proved too corrupted to save, their ecosystems so thoroughly compromised that restoring them to habitability would require centuries of effort. The Inquisition ordered exterminatus on several worlds, where the corruption had spread beyond any hope of containment, destroying the planets entirely rather than allowing them to serve as sources of infection that might spread to neighboring systems. The strategic impact of the Plague Wars extended beyond the immediate damage to Ultramar's worlds and populations. The invasion demonstrated Chaos's ability to conduct coordinated campaigns on a scale not seen since the Horus Heresy, with Mortarian's forces operating according to strategic plans that targeted specific worlds and objectives rather than conducting random raids. The Death Guard's success in corrupting multiple worlds within Ultramar, despite the realm's superior defenses and Guilliman's personal leadership, showed that even the Imperium's best defended regions remained vulnerable to determined Chaos assault. The resources required to resist the invasion and reclaim lost territory-strained Ultramar's capabilities, despite the realm's advantages in organization and supply. The Orc presence in the Segmentum Ultima represents a permanent and self-perpetuating threat that differs fundamentally from the strategic challenges posed by Chaos or the Tyranids, where Chaos forces pursue specific objectives related to corruption and conquest, and Tyranids follow biological imperatives to consume biomass. Orcs exist in a state of perpetual warfare driven by their genetic programming and fungal biology. The greenskins reproduce through spores released when they die, meaning every battlefield where orcs fight becomes a potential source of future infestations. Imperial forces that successfully defeat an orc invasion must then conduct extensive cleansing operations to prevent spores from developing into new orc populations, a process that requires decades of vigilance and frequently fails to achieve complete eradication. The Octarius Empire stands as one of the largest orc concentrations in the entire galaxy, a sprawling domain of conquered worlds united under the rule of the Overfiend of Octarius. This massive orc warlord commands resources and populations that rival some Imperial sectors, his empire having grown through centuries of conquest and consolidation that saw him defeat or absorb rival orc warbands, until his authority extended across dozens of systems. The Overfiend's power base includes multiple forge worlds captured from the Imperium and converted to produce orc weapons and vehicles, their production capacity redirected toward churning out the crude but effective equipment that greenskin armies require in vast quantities. The Empire's worlds host billions of orcs, along with enslaved populations of Gretchen and captured humans who labor in the Overfiend's war factories. The Octarius Empire's military strength stems from the Overfiend's ability to maintain discipline and coordination among orc forces that would normally fragment into competing factions. The warlord achieved this through a combination of personal combat prowess that made him the biggest and strongest orc in his domain, and a degree of tactical cunning unusual even among orc warbosses. The Overfiend understands logistics and strategic planning in ways that most orcs cannot grasp, ensuring his armies receive adequate supplies of ammunition and fuel rather than running out mid-campaign, as frequently happens with less organized wags. His forces employ combined arms tactics that coordinate boys' infantry, with armored support from battle wagons and air cover from Dakajets, creating military operations that function more effectively than the chaotic mob attacks typical of smaller orc forces. The Empire's location in the Eastern Fringe placed it in a position to threaten Imperial worlds throughout the region, with orc raiders from Octarius conducting attacks that ranged from small-scale looting expeditions to full invasions involving millions of greenskins. The Overfiend's strategic vision extended beyond simple raiding, as he worked to expand his empire's borders through systematic conquest of neighboring systems. Imperial commanders facing Octarius forces found themselves dealing with enemies who maintained supply lines, conducted reconnaissance, and adapted their tactics based on observed weaknesses in Imperial defenses. These capabilities made the Octarius Empire significantly more dangerous than typical orc infestations, as the greenskins could sustain operations over extended periods and coordinate attacks across multiple systems simultaneously. The Octarius War began when Inquisitor Kryptman of the Ordo Xenos implemented a strategy so controversial that it resulted in his excommunication from the Inquisition despite his status as one of the Imperium's foremost experts on the Tyranid threat. Kryptman had tracked Hive fleet Leviathans advance through the galaxy, and calculated that the Tyranids would consume countless Imperial worlds as they pushed deeper into the Segmentum Ultima. The Inquisitor conceived a plan to redirect Leviathan's advance toward the Octarius Empire, reasoning that the massive Orc population would provide the Tyranids with an attractive target, while simultaneously pitting two major threats against each other. The strategy required manipulating Leviathan's path through careful destruction of potential food sources and the placement of pheromone markers that would attract the hive mind's attention toward Octarius. The implementation of Kryptman's strategy involved operations across multiple sectors as the Inquisitor and his agents worked to guide Leviathan toward its collision with the Octarius Empire. Imperial forces conducted exterminatus operations on worlds that lay in Leviathan's path, destroying their biospheres to eliminate them as potential food sources that might delay the Hive fleet's advance. These actions killed billions of Imperial citizens who might otherwise have been evacuated or defended, a cost that Kryptman calculated as acceptable given the alternative of allowing Leviathan to continue its unchecked advance through heavily populated Imperial space. The Inquisitor's willingness to sacrifice entire worlds to achieve his strategic objective demonstrated the ruthless pragmatism that characterized his approach to combating existential threats. The collision between Hive Fleet Leviathan and the Octarius Empire created a conflict of unprecedented scale and ferocity. The Tyranids arrived in Octarius space with bioships numbering in the millions, their swarms prepared to overwhelm and consume the Orc populations as they had countless other species. The Overfiend of Octarius responded by rallying his forces for what he proclaimed would be the greatest fight in Orc history, a battle against enemies who matched the Greenskins in numbers and exceeded them in coordination. Orcs from across the Empire, and even from neighboring systems flocked to Octarius, drawn by reports of endless enemies to fight and the opportunity to participate in a legendary WoW. The resulting concentration of Orc forces created armies that numbered in the billions, masses of greenskins eager to test themselves against the Tyranid swarms. The initial battles on Octarius worlds demonstrated that the Tyranids had encountered enemies fundamentally different from the prey species they typically consumed. Orcs fought with an enthusiasm that increased rather than decreased as casualties mounted, the Greenskins viewing death in combat as the best possible fate and growing more excited as the fighting intensified. The Tyranid strategy of overwhelming enemies through numerical superiority and perfect coordination met Orc tactics that embraced chaos and individual initiative, creating battlefields where billions of organisms clashed in struggles that lasted for months without clear victor. The hive mind adapted its approach to account for Orc psychology and combat effectiveness, but the Greenskins' ability to grow stronger through fighting and their reproduction through spores meant that every battle fed both sides' ability to continue the war. The Octarius War's progression over the following years exceeded even Kryptman's pessimistic projections for how the conflict might develop. Rather than weakening both sides to the point where they could be eliminated by Imperial forces, the war created conditions where both Orcs and Tyranids grew stronger through constant combat. The Orcs evolved more dangerous subspecies as their genetic memory adapted to fighting Tyranids, producing larger and more aggressive boys who could match Tyranid warrior organisms in close combat. The Tyranids consumed Orc biomass and incorporated useful genetic traits into their own organisms, creating hybrid creatures that combined Tyranid biology with Orc resilience and aggression. The war zone expanded as both sides brought in reinforcements, and the fighting spread to neighboring systems, threatening to engulf entire sectors in a three-way conflict between Orcs, Tyranids, and Imperial forces attempting to contain both. The strategic consequences of the Octarius War for the wider Segmentum Ultima proved catastrophic in ways that vindicated the Inquisition's decision to excommunicate Kryptman despite his intentions. The conflict created a training ground where both Orcs and Tyranids evolved to become more effective killers, with survivors from Octarius carrying these improvements to other battlefields. Orc warbands that escaped the war zone proved significantly more dangerous than typical Greenskin forces, their experience fighting Tyranids having taught them tactics and generated genetic adaptations that made them formidable opponents even for space marine forces. Tyranid organisms that consumed orc biomass and survived the intense combat developed resistances and capabilities that made them more effective against all enemies, not just greenskins. The wars spread beyond its intended containment area meant that Imperial worlds found themselves facing invasion from both orcs and Tyranids simultaneously, forcing defenders to fight enemies on multiple fronts while both Xenos species grew stronger through combat. The Charadin campaign represented another major orc threat to Imperial holdings in the Segmentum Ultima, this one predating the Octarius War, but demonstrating the destructive potential of a well-organized Waag led by a cunning warboss. Waag Snagrod emerged from the Charadin sector under the leadership of Arch-Arsonist Snagrod, an orc warlord who combined the typical greenskin love of destruction with unusual strategic planning capabilities. Snagrod organized his forces into a coherent invasion army rather than the typical orc mob, implementing supply systems and coordination between different orc clans that allowed his Waag to sustain operations across multiple systems simultaneously. The Arch-Arsonist's forces included substantial numbers of Burna Boys and mech specialists who excelled at destroying infrastructure and vehicles, giving the Waag particular effectiveness against fortified positions and armored forces. The Loki sector bore the brunt of Waag Snagrod's aggression as orc forces swept through Imperial space, conducting raids and invasions that overwhelmed local defense forces. The Greenskins attacked with a level of coordination that caught Imperial commanders unprepared, as they had expected typical orc disorganization rather than the systematic campaign that Snagrod implemented. Orc forces struck at multiple worlds simultaneously, preventing Imperial reinforcements from concentrating against any single invasion and forcing defenders to spread their limited resources across threatened systems. The Waag's mobility, provided by a substantial fleet of looted and orc-built spacecraft, allowed Snagrod to maintain the initiative and attack targets of his choosing while avoiding Imperial counter-offensives. The invasion of Rin's world brought Waag Snagrod into direct conflict with the Crimson Fists chapter, a confrontation that nearly resulted in the chapter's extinction. The Crimson Fists maintained their fortress monastery on Rin's world, a heavily fortified position that should have been capable of withstanding any conventional orc assault. Snagrod's forces approached the world in massive numbers, their fleet including hundreds of crewed spacecraft carrying millions of orcs prepared for a planetary invasion. The Crimson Fists prepared to defend their homeworld, deploying their full chapter strength and coordinating with planetary defense forces to resist the coming assault. The chapter's leadership calculated that their fortifications and the quality of their warriors would allow them to defeat the orcs despite being outnumbered, a reasonable assessment based on previous engagements against greenskin forces. The disaster that befell the Crimson Fists resulted from a catastrophic accident rather than orc military superiority. A missile in the fortress monastery's arsenal detonated due to a malfunction, the explosion triggering a chain reaction that destroyed the entire stockpile. The resulting blast devastated the fortress monastery and killed hundreds of space marines who had been preparing for the defense. Chapter Master Pedro Cantor survived along with a handful of battle brothers, but the chapter's strength had been reduced from nearly 1,000 warriors to fewer than 200 in an instant. The fortress monastery lay in ruins, its defenses shattered and its armories destroyed along with most of the chapter's equipment and vehicles. The Crimson Fists found themselves facing a massive orc invasion with a fraction of their normal strength, and without the fortifications they had relied upon for their defensive strategy. The subsequent campaign to defend Rin's world tested the surviving Crimson Fists beyond anything they had previously endured. Cantor led his depleted forces in a fighting withdrawal from the ruined fortress monastery, conducting hit-and-run attacks against orc forces while attempting to link up with surviving planetary defense forces. The chapter master recognized that conventional defensive tactics would fail given his limited numbers, instead implementing a strategy of mobility and surgical strikes against Orc leadership and logistics. Crimson Fist's kill teams infiltrated Orc-held territory to assassinate warbosses and destroy supply dumps, creating chaos within the WAG's command structure and slowing its advance. These operations cost the chapter additional casualties it could not afford, but they bought time for Imperial reinforcements to arrive. The relief of Rin's world required intervention from multiple Space Marine chapters and Imperial Navy battle groups, the scale of forces necessary to defeat WAG Snagrod, demonstrating the threat that a well-organized Orc invasion posed even to Space Marine homeworlds. The Crimson Fists had been reduced to approximately 100 battle brothers by the time reinforcements arrived, the chapter having paid a terrible price to hold out against overwhelming numbers. The combined Imperial forces eventually drove Snagrod's WAG from Rin's world and pursued the Orcs through the Loki sector, but the arch-arsonist himself escaped to continue raiding Imperial space. The Crimson Fists faced decades of rebuilding to restore their chapter to full strength, the near extinction serving as a reminder that even Space Marines remained vulnerable to catastrophic losses when circumstances aligned against them. The recurring nature of Orc threats throughout the Segmentum Ultima stems from the fundamental biology that makes greenskins impossible to permanently eradicate through conventional military means. Orcs reproduce through spores that they release throughout their lives, and especially upon death. These microscopic organisms, capable of surviving in soil for years before developing into new Orcs. An Imperial force that defeats an Orc invasion and kills every greenskin on a world has not eliminated the threat, as spores left behind will eventually grow into new Orcs, who must then be hunted down and killed in turn. The cycle continues indefinitely unless every square meter of affected territory receives treatment that destroys the spores, a process requiring resources and time that the Imperium rarely has available given the constant demands of fighting on multiple fronts. The Orc psychology that drives their constant warfare creates a threat that cannot be deterred or negotiated within the way that some Xeno species might be managed. Orcs exist to fight, their entire culture and biology oriented toward combat and the pursuit of what they consider a good scrap. Attempts to establish peaceful relations with Orcs inevitably fail because greenskins view peace as boring and will attack simply to generate the violence they crave. The Orc concept of diplomacy extends only to temporary truces between rival warbands who unite against a common enemy before inevitably turning on each other once that enemy has been defeated. Imperial forces cannot reason with Orcs or convince them to leave Imperial space alone, as the greenskins will always seek out fights regardless of strategic considerations or self-preservation instincts that might influence other species. The challenge of permanent eradication means that Imperial strategy against Orcs focuses on containment and suppression rather than elimination. Battle fleets patrol known Orc-held systems to intercept raiding parties before they can reach Imperial worlds, accepting that some raiders will inevitably slip through, but working to minimize the damage they inflict. Planetary governors in regions threatened by Orc activity maintain standing defense forces, trained specifically in anti-Orc tactics, their troops equipped with flamers and other weapons effective against greenskin biology. The Inquisition monitors worlds for signs of Orc spore infestation, dispatching cleansing teams to eliminate small Orc populations before they can grow into full WAGs. These efforts achieve partial success at best, as the sheer scale of Orc presence throughout the galaxy ensures that new threats constantly emerge to replace those that Imperial forces manage to suppress. The weaponization of Orc aggression by Imperial strategists represents one of the more controversial tactics employed in the Segmentum Ultima's defense. The concept involves deliberately seeding Orcs on worlds held by Chaos forces or other enemies, allowing the greenskins to establish themselves and then inevitably attack the current occupants. The strategy exploits Orc psychology and biology to create self-sustaining threats that tie down enemy forces without requiring ongoing Imperial commitment. Chaos warbands that conquer a world and then face Orc invasion must divert resources to fighting the greenskins, rather than conducting operations against Imperial targets. The orcs grow stronger through combat regardless of whether they win or lose individual battles, creating a persistent threat that enemy forces cannot simply eliminate and move on. The catastrophic potential of such strategies became undeniably apparent through the Octarius War's development. Kryptman's manipulation of Hive Fleet Leviathan into collision with the Octarius Empire demonstrated how weaponizing Xeno's aggression could spiral beyond Imperial control and create threats worse than the original problems they were meant to address. The war produced stronger orcs and more dangerous Tyranids while spreading both species beyond the intended containment area, ultimately threatening Imperial worlds throughout multiple sectors. The Inquisitor's excommunication reflected the Inquisition's recognition that his strategy, while theoretically sound, had produced results that endangered the Imperium more than maintaining the status quo would have. The lesson that such manipulations carry unacceptable risks has not prevented other Imperial commanders from attempting similar strategies on smaller scales, though the Octarius War serves as a cautionary example of how badly things can go wrong. The orc threat to shipping lanes throughout the Segmentum Ultima creates constant economic and military pressure that forces the Imperium to maintain substantial naval assets dedicated to convoy protection and anti-piracy operations. Orc freebooters operate throughout the region in spacecraft that range from crude converted asteroids to looted Imperial vessels that the Greenskins have modified with additional weapons and armor. These pirates attack merchant convoys, isolated stations, and even military vessels when opportunities present themselves, their raids disrupting trade and forcing the Imperial Navy to escort valuable shipments rather than concentrating forces for offensive operations. The freebooters answer to no central authority and pursue targets based on individual captains' whims, making their movements unpredictable and difficult to counter through conventional patrol patterns. The isolated worlds throughout the Segmentum Ultima's frontier regions face particular vulnerability to orc raids and invasions, as these planets often lack the military forces necessary to resist even relatively small greenskin incursions. A world with a population of a few million and only planetary defense forces equipped with basic weapons cannot withstand an orc WAAG that arrives with millions of boys supported by armored vehicles and air support. The Imperium's strategic priorities mean that such worlds receive limited support, as military assets get directed toward defending more valuable or populous systems. Frontier worlds that fall to orc invasion often remain under greenskin control for years or decades before Imperial forces can spare the resources to mount reclamation operations, by which time the orcs have thoroughly looted everything of value and established themselves so firmly that removing them requires extensive military campaigns. The orc presence in the Segmentum Ultima shows no signs of diminishing despite millennia of Imperial efforts to suppress it. Every defeated WAAG leaves behind spores that will eventually produce new orcs. Every destroyed orc vessel releases survivors who establish themselves on whatever world they crash into. And every period of relative peace simply allows existing orc populations to grow until they reach critical mass and launch new invasions. The Greenskins represent a permanent fixture of the Eastern Fringe's strategic landscape, a threat that the Imperium must constantly monitor and combat without any realistic hope of achieving final victory. Imperial forces that defeat one orc invasion can be certain that another will emerge eventually, the cycle of violence continuing indefinitely as long as orcs exist anywhere in the galaxy. The Necron awakening throughout the Segmentum Ultima represents a threat fundamentally different from the biological horrors of the Tyranids or the spiritual corruption of chaos. These ancient beings ruled the galaxy 60 million years before humanity's ancestors crawled from the oceans of Terra, their civilization having achieved technological supremacy that made them masters of reality itself before they underwent biotransference, and became the soulless machines that now emerge from tomb worlds scattered across Imperial space. The Necrons went into hibernation during the War in Heaven, their stasis tombs designed to preserve them, until the galaxy had recovered from that ancient conflict and could be reclaimed by its rightful rulers. The Great Rift's opening and the general increase in galactic instability has triggered awakening protocols across countless tomb worlds, with Necron dynasties rising to find their former empire claimed by upstart species who must be exterminated or enslaved. The Sodek dynasty operates from the Sodek system in the Eastern Fringe, their awakening having occurred earlier than many other dynasties due to damage to their tomb complex's stasis systems. The Sodek overlord commands legions of Necron warriors supported by the full technological arsenal that their civilization developed over millions of years of warfare. Their forces employ Gauss weapons that strip matter apart at the molecular level, leaving nothing but dust where armored vehicles or fortified positions stood moments before. Necron warriors march forward in perfect unison, their living metal bodies regenerating damage that would destroy conventional troops, while their reanimation protocols return fallen warriors to combat within minutes. The dynasty's forces have conducted campaigns throughout the Eastern Fringe, attacking Imperial worlds to reclaim territory they consider rightfully theirs, and eliminating any resistance with the cold efficiency of machines following ancient programming. The Sodek military doctrine emphasizes overwhelming firepower and technological superiority over tactical flexibility. Their immortals advance in disciplined formations, their Gauss blasters eliminating enemy infantry and light vehicles with sustained fire that never slackens due to ammunition concerns or crew fatigue. Lich Guards serve as elite infantry, equipped with war scythes or hyperphase swords capable of cutting through power armor and vehicle hulls with equal ease. Canoptech constructs provide specialized support, with Canoptech wraiths phasing through solid matter to attack from unexpected angles, while Canoptech spiders repair damaged warriors and maintain the dynasty's war machines. The Sodek deploy monoliths as mobile fortresses, these massive constructs teleporting warriors directly into combat, while their particle whip arrays devastate anything within range. The Cetan shards that some Necron dynasties have enslaved and weaponized represent fragments of the ancient star gods, who the Necrons betrayed and shattered during their rebellion against their former masters. These reality-warping entities possess power that defies conventional physics, their abilities allowing them to manipulate time, transmute matter, and unleash energies that can devastate entire armies. The Deceiver's shards specialize in illusion and misdirection, creating phantom armies that draw enemy fire, while real Necron forces attack from unexpected directions. The Nightbringer's fragments embody death itself, their presence causing terror in living beings, while their touch drains life force and leaves nothing but withered corpses. Imperial forces that encounter Cetan shards face enemies that cannot be fought through conventional military means, as the Star God's powers operate on levels that make standard weapons and tactics ineffective. The technological capabilities that Necron forces demonstrate on the battlefield exceed anything the Imperium can field, a disparity that reflects the 60 million years of advancement that separated Necron civilization from humanity's current state. Necron spacecraft employ inertialess drives that allow them to maneuver in ways that violate known physics, making them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons. Their portal technology enables instantaneous transportation across vast distances, with Necron forces appearing in Imperial systems without warning and withdrawing before effective responses can be organized. The living metal that composes Necron bodies and equipment repairs itself automatically, with damage regenerating over time unless the destruction proves so complete that the reanimation protocols cannot restore function. This self-repair capability means that defeating Necron forces requires total annihilation rather than simply inflicting casualties, as wounded warriors will return to combat if given time to regenerate. The strategic threat posed by awakening tomb worlds extends beyond individual military engagements to the fundamental question of how many Necron dynasties remain dormant throughout the galaxy. Imperial records contain fragmentary information about tomb world locations, with most such sites having been lost during Old Night or never properly cataloged in the first place. Every world the Imperium controls potentially hosts a Necron tomb complex beneath its surface, the ancient Xenos having established their empire across the galaxy long before humanity existed. The awakening of a tomb world on an Imperial planet creates an immediate crisis as Necron forces emerge from underground complexes and begin exterminating the human population they consider trespassers on their territory. Planetary defense forces find themselves facing enemies that emerge from beneath cities and military installations, attacking from directions that defensive planning never anticipated. The Atrud represent one of the most poorly understood Xenos species that Imperial forces encounter in the Segmentum Ultima, these creatures existing partially outside normal space-time in ways that make them difficult to observe or combat effectively. The Atrud appear as hunched, roughly humanoid figures wrapped in tattered cloaks that obscure their true forms, though few observers survive close encounters long enough to provide detailed descriptions. Their most devastating weapon manifests as a temporal field that ages everything within its radius, with humans exposed to Atrud presence experiencing decades or centuries of aging within minutes. Vehicles and equipment corrode and fail as their materials undergo accelerated decay, power armor systems failing as their components age beyond functionality. The Atrud use these temporal effects both defensively and offensively, creating zones where Imperial forces cannot operate while they conduct their mysterious activities. The Atrud migrations that periodically sweep through regions of the Segmentum Ultima cause devastation that exceeds conventional military invasions in some ways. These movements involve billions of Atrud traveling through the webway and other dimensional passages, their journey bringing them into contact with Imperial worlds that happen to lie along their route. The Xenos do not attack in the conventional sense, but simply pass through inhabited areas, their temporal fields aging everything in their path. Cities become ruins within hours as buildings age centuries in minutes, their structures collapsing as materials fail. Human populations caught in Atrud migration paths die of extreme old age, their bodies withering to dust, while the Xenos move past without apparent awareness or concern. The migrations follow patterns that Imperial xenobiologists cannot predict, with Atrud populations appearing in systems without warning and disappearing just as suddenly once they have passed through. The nature of Atrud society remains almost completely unknown to Imperial authorities despite millennia of occasional contact. The Xenos communicate through methods that humans cannot perceive or understand, their interactions with each other occurring through means that may involve temporal manipulation or extra-dimensional signaling. Attempts to capture Atrud specimens for study invariably fail, as the creatures either escape through dimensional passages or die in ways that leave no useful remains for examination. The few Atrud artifacts recovered from sites they have passed through consist of objects whose purpose cannot be determined and whose materials resist analysis through conventional means. Imperial xenobiologists theorize that the Atrud may exist simultaneously across multiple time periods, their true nature extending beyond the three-dimensional space that humans perceive, but such theories remain speculation without supporting evidence. The military response to Atrud incursions focuses on avoidance and containment rather than direct combat, as Imperial forces have learned through bitter experience that engaging Atrud directly results in catastrophic casualties without achieving meaningful objectives. Planetary governors who receive warning of Atrud migrations evacuate populations from predicted paths rather than attempting to defend in place. Military forces establish cordon zones around areas where Atrud have been detected, preventing civilians from entering while monitoring the Xenos' movement and waiting for them to depart. The Ordo Xenos maintains specialized teams equipped with temporal shielding technology that provides limited protection against Atrud aging effects, though even these specialists avoid direct confrontation when possible and focus on observation and intelligence gathering rather than combat operations. Craftworld Eandon operates in the Eastern Fringe as a shadow of its former glory, the Craftworld having suffered catastrophic losses during its encounter with Hive Fleet Kraken that killed more than 3/4 of its population. The surviving Eldari found themselves outnumbered by their own dead, the spirit stones of fallen warriors exceeding the living population by orders of magnitude. This demographic catastrophe forced Eandon to rely on Wraith constructs to maintain military capability, with Wraith Guards and Wraith Blades forming the core of the Craftworld's armies, rather than serving as specialized units supporting living warriors. The spirit stones of dead Eldari animate these constructs, allowing the Fallen to continue fighting in defense of their Craftworld, even after their bodies have been destroyed. Eandon's forces present an eerie sight on the battlefield, with ranks of ghostly constructs advancing in silence, while the few living Eldari coordinate their movements and provide psychic support. The Craftworld's military operations in the Segmentum Ultima focus on survival and the protection of remaining Eldari populations, rather than the aggressive campaigns that characterized Eandon before Kraken's attack. The Craftworld Seers monitor the skein of fate for threats to Eldari interests, deploying forces to intercept dangers before they can develop into existential crises. Eandon warriors conduct raids against Chaos forces that threaten to establish permanent bases in the Eastern Fringe, recognizing that Chaos corruption poses threats to Eldari as well as humans. They attack Orc Wags that grow large enough to threaten Craftworld's safe passages through real space. They monitor Necron tomb world awakenings and occasionally strike at newly emerged dynasties before they can fully restore their strength. These operations reflect Eandon's reduced circumstances, as the Craftworld lacks the population to conduct extended campaigns and must carefully husband its limited resources. The relationship between Eandon and the Imperium exists in a state of pragmatic neutrality that occasionally develops into temporary cooperation against mutual threats. The Craftworld's forces have fought alongside Imperial armies against Tyranid splinter fleets, both sides recognizing that the hive mind represents an existential threat to all biological life in the galaxy. Eandon Rangers have provided intelligence to Imperial commanders about Chaos movements, the Eldari's superior information gathering capabilities, and their own interest in preventing Chaos expansion, creating situations where cooperation serves both species' interests. These alliances remain temporary and limited in scope, with both sides maintaining fundamental distrust and returning to their usual state of mutual hostility once immediate threats have been addressed. Imperial commanders who work with Eandon forces understand that the Xenos will abandon or betray their human allies without hesitation if doing so serves Eldari interests. Craftworld Biel-Tan's shattering during the Gathering Storm events fundamentally altered the Eldari military presence in the Segmentum Ultima. The Craftworld had maintained the most aggressive stance toward other species of any major Craftworld, its aspect warriors conducting campaigns aimed at reclaiming maiden worlds and driving younger races from territory the Eldari considered rightfully theirs. Biel-Tan's forces specialized in lightning raids and surgical strikes, their armies built around aspect warriors supported by guardians and vehicles that emphasized speed and firepower over resilience. The Craftworld's military doctrine reflected its ideology that the Eldari must reclaim their dominance through force of arms, with Biel-Tan warhosts attacking Imperial worlds, Orc settlements, and other Xenos' presence with equal determination. The fracturing of Biel-Tan occurred when the Craftworld's Infinity Circuit suffered catastrophic damage during a battle with Chaos forces, the psychic backlash tearing the Craftworld's structure apart and killing thousands of Eldari. The survivors found themselves scattered across multiple fragments of what had been a unified Craftworld, each piece maintaining some functionality, but unable to operate independently as Biel-Tan had before its destruction. The largest fragment, designated Biel-Tan Prime, maintains the Craftworld's military traditions and continues conducting operations in the Eastern Fringe, though on a reduced scale that reflects its diminished resources and population. Other fragments have pursued different paths, with some joining the Unari faction, while others maintain independence and focus on survival rather than the aggressive expansion that characterized Biel-Tan's previous operations. The Unari movement that emerged from the awakening of Unid has established a presence throughout the Segmentum Ultima, recruiting followers from various Craftworlds and even from the Drukhari of Komorog. These Eldari follow Ivrain, the prophet of Unid, believing that their god of the dead offers a path to salvation from Slaanesh's eternal hunger for Eldari souls. The Unari conduct operations aimed at gathering the Kroneswords necessary to fully awaken Unid, artifacts scattered across the galaxy that must be recovered regardless of the cost. Their forces include warriors from multiple craft worlds fighting alongside each other, a level of cooperation that would have been impossible before Unid's awakening provided a unifying cause. The Unari have demonstrated willingness to work with humans when necessary, their alliance with Guilliman during his resurrection, establishing precedent for cooperation that traditional craft worlds would never have considered. The minor Xeno species that inhabit the Segmentum Ultima represent threats that receive less attention than major powers like the Tyranids or Necrons, but still pose significant dangers to Imperial worlds. The Quorl Swarmhood operates from their home systems in the Eastern Fringe, these insectoid Xenos having developed a civilization based on hive structures and collective intelligence that rivals the Imperium in technological sophistication. The Quorl expand through systematic conquest and assimilation, their swarm fleets attacking neighboring systems and establishing new hive colonies on conquered worlds. Imperial forces that encounter Quorl military formations face enemies that coordinate with perfect efficiency, their warriors operating as extensions of a collective consciousness that adapts to threats in real time. The Quorl use biological weapons and genetic engineering extensively, modifying their warrior castes to counter specific enemies and deploying plague organisms designed to devastate human populations while leaving Quorl hives unaffected. The Rakghal represent a particularly savage Xeno species that conducts raids throughout the Eastern Fringe from bases in the Coronus Expanse and other lawless regions. These cyborg creatures combine biological bodies with extensive mechanical augmentation, their forms bristling with weapons and armor plates that make them formidable combatants. The Rakghal attack without warning or apparent strategic purpose, beyond acquiring technology and slaves, their raids targeting isolated colonies and merchant vessels that cannot defend themselves effectively. Imperial forces that engage Rakghal raiding parties report facing enemies who fight with bestial ferocity, enhanced by sophisticated weapons and armor. The combination of savage aggression and advanced technology making them dangerous opponents despite their relatively small numbers and lack of organized empire. The Frail maintain a mysterious presence in the Segmentum Ultima's unexplored regions, these diminutive Xenos operating from hidden bases and conducting activities that Imperial intelligence agencies struggle to monitor or understand. The Frail possess advanced technology that includes sophisticated spacecraft and weapons, their capabilities suggesting a civilization with substantial resources despite their apparent preference for remaining hidden from other species. Encounters with Frail forces remain rare, with most contact occurring when Imperial exploration fleets stumble upon their installations, or when Frail vessels appear briefly before disappearing into uncharted space. The Ordo Xenos considers the Frail a potential major threat that has simply chosen not to reveal its full capabilities, with some xenobiologists theorizing that the species maintains a hidden empire of significant size that deliberately avoids contact with other galactic powers. The Imperium's xenocidal policies toward all non-human species reflect the fundamental ideology that humanity must dominate the galaxy or face extinction at the hands of alien civilizations. The doctrine of "suffer not the Xenos to live" guides Imperial military operations and civilian governance, with any discovery of alien presence on Imperial worlds triggering immediate extermination protocols. Planetary governors who attempt to negotiate with Xenos or who fail to report alien contact face charges of treason and execution, the Imperium maintaining zero tolerance for any accommodation with non-human species. This absolute stance stems from humanity's experiences during Old Night and the Age of Strife, when Xenos species attacked human worlds and enslaved populations that lacked the strength to defend themselves. The Emperor's Great Crusade aimed to reclaim human space and eliminate Xenos threats, establishing the principle that humanity's survival required the destruction of all potential competitors for galactic dominance. The practical implementation of xenocidal policies varies significantly depending on local circumstances and the specific xenos species involved. Imperial forces that encounter minor xenos threats on newly discovered worlds conduct systematic extermination operations, using orbital bombardment and ground forces to eliminate alien populations down to the last individual. Worlds that host established xenos civilizations require more extensive military campaigns, with Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine forces conducting operations that may last years or decades to completely purge alien presence. The challenge of unknown xenos species creates situations where Imperial forces must develop tactics and strategies without prior intelligence about enemy capabilities or weaknesses, leading to higher casualties and longer campaigns than would be necessary against familiar opponents. The Death Watch maintains specialized kill teams throughout the Segmentum Ultima, specifically trained and equipped to combat xenos threats that conventional Imperial forces cannot effectively engage. These Space Marines drawn from various chapters serve in the Ordo Xenos' military arm, their experience and equipment allowing them to tackle threats ranging from Genestealer infestations to Necron tomb world investigations. Deathwatch kill teams operate with considerable autonomy, their missions often involving deep penetration into Xenos-held territory to gather intelligence, eliminate high-value targets, or recover xenotech artifacts for inquisitorial study. The specialized ammunition and weapons that Deathwatch Marines carry include Hellfire rounds designed to be particularly effective against biological targets, and specialized equipment for combating specific xenos species based on accumulated knowledge about their weaknesses. The accumulation of xenobiological data by the Ordo Xenos represents centuries of study and combat experience against the various alien species that threaten Imperial space. Inquisitors specializing in xenos threats maintain extensive databases cataloging known species, their capabilities, weaknesses, and behavioral patterns. This information guides Imperial military operations and helps commanders develop effective tactics against enemies they may never have personally encountered. The challenge lies in the galaxy's sheer diversity of xenos life, with new species regularly discovered and existing ones evolving or adapting in ways that render previous intelligence obsolete. The Tyranids exemplify this problem, as their ability to rapidly evolve new organisms means that tactics effective against one hive fleet may prove useless against another that has adapted different biological solutions to similar challenges. The tension between xenocidal ideology and practical necessity creates situations where Imperial authorities must make compromises that officially they cannot acknowledge. Rogue traders operating under warrants that grant them authority to travel beyond Imperial borders frequently conduct trade with xenos species, their activities technically legal under their charters, but contradicting the Imperium's stated policy of total xenos extermination. Some Imperial commanders facing overwhelming threats have accepted temporary alliances with xenos forces, their pragmatic recognition that survival requires cooperation with aliens, conflicting with doctrinal demands for immediate hostility toward all non-humans. These compromises remain unofficial and unacknowledged, with participants understanding that admitting to such cooperation would result in inquisitorial investigation and likely execution regardless of the practical benefits achieved. The conclusion of the Indomitus Crusade in the early years of the 42nd millennium left the Segmentum Ultima in a state fundamentally transformed from what had existed before the Great Rift's opening. Robot Guilliman's massive military operation had achieved significant objectives across the Eastern Fringe, relieving besieged worlds and establishing new defensive networks, but the strategic situation remained precarious. The Crusade's fleet groups had reclaimed territory lost to chaos incursions and pushed back Xenos invasions in multiple sectors, yet these victories came at costs that would take decades to fully account for. Entire Space Marine chapters had been reduced to fragments of their original strength despite Primaris reinforcements. Imperial Guard regiments that had fought through years of continuous campaigning returned home with casualty rates exceeding 70%. The Imperial Navy lost hundreds of vessels to combat and operational attrition, losses that shipyards throughout the Segmentum struggled to replace given the demands placed on their production capacity. The establishment of fortress worlds throughout the Segmentum represented one of the Crusade's most significant strategic achievements. These heavily fortified planets occupied positions that allowed them to anchor defensive networks and serve as staging grounds for military operations deeper into contested space. Each fortress world received substantial garrison forces drawn from multiple Imperial Guard regiments, supported by planetary defense forces recruited locally and equipped to standards exceeding typical PDF capabilities. The fortifications themselves combined traditional defensive architecture with modern weapons systems, their walls mounting void shields, macro cannons, and lance batteries capable of engaging targets in orbit. Underground complexes housed supplies sufficient to sustain the garrisons through extended sieges, with ammunition stockpiles, food stores, and water purification systems designed to function independently for years if necessary. The integration of Primaris space Marines into existing chapters proceeded with varying degrees of success across the Segmentum. Chapters that had suffered catastrophic losses generally welcomed the reinforcements without significant resistance, their desperate need for manpower overriding concerns about tradition or the differences between Primaris and traditional battle brothers. The Scythes of the Emperor exemplified this pattern, their near extinction by hive fleet crocking creating circumstances where Primaris reinforcements represented salvation rather than disruption. Other chapters struggled with integration challenges that stemmed from cultural differences and questions about whether Primaris Marines truly understood the traditions and combat doctrines that had served for 10 millennia. The Blood Angels and their successors faced particular complications regarding whether Primaris Marines experienced the Red Thirst and Black Rage with the same intensity as traditional battle brothers. Early observations suggesting possible resistance to these genetic flaws, though long-term data remained incomplete. The Imperium Nihilus portion of the Segmentum Ultima exists in a state of isolation that has fundamentally altered how Imperial authority functions in those regions. The Great Rift's presence between these worlds and Terra means that the Astronomican's light does not reach them, leaving navigators blind to its guidance and making warp travel exponentially more dangerous. Communication with Terra occurs sporadically at best, with astropathic messages requiring months or years to traverse the distances involved when they arrive at all. Many worlds on the dark side of the rift have received no contact from the wider Imperium since the Cicatrix Maledictum's opening, their populations uncertain whether the Imperium they serve still exists or if they represent the last bastions of human civilization in their region of space. The emergence of isolated empires within the Imperium Nihilus reflects the reality that worlds cut off from central authority must either organize themselves for survival or fall to the enemies pressing from all sides. Some planetary governors have assumed authority over neighboring systems, creating ad hoc administrative structures that provide coordination and mutual support across multiple worlds. These improvised empires function according to local interpretations of imperial law and doctrine, their leaders making decisions that would normally require approval from Terra, but cannot wait for guidance that may never arrive. The most successful of these regional powers have established functioning supply chains, organized defense pacts between multiple systems, and maintained some semblance of imperial governance despite their isolation. Others have devolved into petty tyrannies, where individual governors rule as absolute monarchs, their authority unchecked by any higher power, and their populations suffering under regimes that bear little resemblance to legitimate imperial administration. The desperate alliances that have formed within the Imperium Nihilus include cooperation between imperial forces and Xeno species that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. Isolated imperial commanders facing overwhelming threats have accepted assistance from Eldari craftworlds, their pragmatic recognition that survival requires any available help overriding doctrinal demands for immediate hostility toward all non-humans. Some worlds have negotiated arrangements with Tau forces, trading access to Imperial technology or intelligence in exchange for military support against chaos or Tyranid invasions. These alliances remain unofficial and unacknowledged, with participants understanding that admitting to such cooperation would result in inquisitorial investigation and likely execution if contact with the wider Imperium were ever restored. The moral compromises involved in working with Xenos trouble many Imperial officers, but the alternative of facing extinction alone has convinced some that survival justifies temporary accommodation with humanity's traditional enemies. The Tau Fifth Sphere expansion operations continue to exploit Imperial weakness in the Imperium Nihilus regions of the Segmentum Ultima. The survivors of the Fourth Sphere's catastrophic warp transit have established themselves across multiple systems, their forces operating with a level of aggression and xenophobia that differs markedly from the greater good philosophy that characterizes the main Tau Empire. These Fifth Sphere Tau view their auxiliary species with suspicion and hostility, having blamed them for attracting demonic attention during the Fourth Sphere's warp journey. Reports indicate that Fifth Sphere forces have massacred entire populations of Kroot and other auxiliaries, creating a faction of Tau who more closely resemble the Imperium's xenophobic attitudes than their own civilization's traditional inclusiveness. The Fifth Sphere's military operations focus on consolidating control over conquered territory rather than pushing for rapid expansion. Their commanders have learned from the Fourth Sphere's disaster, implementing cautious strategies that emphasize establishing strong defensive positions and secure supply lines before advancing further. The Tau forces have fortified key worlds within their controlled space, transforming them into bases capable of withstanding Imperial counter-offensives while providing staging grounds for future operations. This methodical approach has proven effective at maintaining gains despite Imperial efforts to reclaim lost territory, as the Tau defensive networks prove difficult to assault without committing forces that Imperial commanders cannot spare given the multiple threats demanding attention throughout the Segmentum. The potential arrival of additional Tyranid hive fleets from the intergalactic void represents perhaps the most existential long-term threat facing the Segmentum Ultima. The hive fleets that have already invaded the galaxy, Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan, appear to be merely the vanguard of a much larger Tyranid presence approaching from beyond the galactic rim. Astropathic observations and long-range augur readings suggest massive concentrations of bioships in the intergalactic void, their numbers potentially dwarfing the combined strength of all previously encountered hive fleets. If these observations prove accurate, the Imperium faces a Tyranid invasion of such scale that conventional military resistance may prove futile regardless of how many forces can be mobilized. The strategic implications of a massive Tyranid invasion extend beyond simple military calculations about force ratios and defensive positions. The hive mind learns from every encounter, incorporating successful tactics and biological adaptations that make subsequent invasions more effective. The Tyranid organisms that consumed Orc biomass during the Octarius War have developed traits that make them more resilient and aggressive, improvements that will spread through the hive fleets as genetic information gets shared across the Tyranid race. Future hive fleets may arrive already adapted to counter Imperial weapons and tactics, their organisms' purpose built to resist the specific threats they will encounter based on information gathered from previous invasions. The prospect of facing Tyranids that have evolved specifically to defeat Space Marines, Imperial Guard formations, and Imperial Navy vessels creates scenarios where humanity's traditional military advantages become irrelevant. The chaos resurgence throughout the Segmentum Ultima has accelerated following the Great Rift's opening, with warp storms erupting more frequently and demon manifestations occurring with disturbing regularity on worlds that had remained stable for centuries. The barrier between real space and the warp has weakened across the entire region, creating conditions that favor chaos forces and make it easier for demons to maintain presence in the material universe. Chaos cults that previously operated in secret have grown bolder, their members openly conducting rituals and spreading corruption, with reduced fear of Imperial retaliation. Some worlds have fallen completely to chaos control, their populations embracing worship of the ruinous powers and transforming their planets into demon worlds, where reality itself warps according to the whims of chaos gods. The Death Guard's continued presence in the Segmentum following the Plague Wars represents an ongoing threat that Imperial forces struggle to contain. Mortarian's Legion maintains bases throughout the region despite their defeat on Ajax and the reclamation of most of Ultramar. Death Guard warbands conduct raids against Imperial worlds, deploying biological weapons that transform entire populations into plague zombies or spread diseases that persist in environments for decades. The Traitor Legion's resilience and their patron god Nurgle's blessings make them nearly impossible to permanently eliminate, as defeated warbands simply withdraw to chaos-held space and rebuild their strength before launching new attacks. The psychological impact of facing enemies who cannot be truly killed demoralizes Imperial defenders and creates situations where victories feel hollow, because everyone knows the Death Guard will return eventually. The Word Bearers maintain their obsessive focus on Ultramar despite repeated defeats, their hatred for Guilliman and his realm driving them to continue attacks that serve vengeance more than strategic purpose. Dark Apostles lead warbands in raids against Ultramar's outer worlds, seeking to establish chaos cults and corrupt Imperial populations through preaching and sorcery. These operations achieve limited success given Ultramar's superior defenses and the vigilance of Ultramarines forces, but the Word Bearers persist regardless of casualties or tactical setbacks. Their willingness to sacrifice entire companies to inflict minor damage on Guilliman's realm reflects the depth of hatred that has festered since Monarchia's destruction during the Great Crusade, a grudge that 10,000 years has not diminished. Eldred Ulthran's warnings regarding the Segmentum Ultima's future have reached Imperial authorities through channels that remain unclear, the ancient Farseer apparently having shared visions with select Inquisitors, despite the traditional hostility between Imperium and Eldari. Eldred's prophecies speak of a great darkness approaching from beyond the galaxy's edge, threats that will make current conflicts seem insignificant by comparison. The Farseer has specifically warned about the Tyranid presence in the intergalactic void, his visions suggesting that the hive fleets already encountered represent merely the first tendrils of a threat vast enough to consume the entire galaxy if left unchecked. Eldred has also spoken of Necron tomb worlds awakening in numbers that will fundamentally alter the balance of power, ancient dynasties rising to reclaim their empire, and viewing all younger races as invaders to be exterminated. The Emperor's tarot readings conducted by the most powerful sanctioned psychers in the Segmentum have produced consistently ominous results regarding the Eastern Fringe's fate. The cards show patterns of destruction and transformation, with traditional symbols of Imperial authority appearing inverted or corrupted in ways that suggest fundamental changes to the established order. The Tower appears repeatedly in readings, indicating catastrophic collapse of existing structures and institutions. The Void Dragon manifests in readings concerning Necron threats, its presence suggesting that ancient powers stir beneath worlds humanity considers safely under Imperial control. The readings provide no clear guidance about how to prevent the disasters they predict, offering only warnings that terrible choices lie ahead and that survival may require sacrifices that challenge everything the Imperium claims to stand for. The ultimate fate of humanity's expansion into the galaxy's edge remains uncertain as the 42nd millennium progresses. The Imperium has reached its maximum sustainable extent, with further expansion impossible given the forces required to defend existing territory against constant threats. The Eastern Fringe represents the absolute limit of Imperial control, worlds beyond which the Astronomican's light fades to nothing, and where human civilization cannot maintain itself without connection to the wider Imperium. Some Imperial philosophers argue that humanity has overextended itself, that the Imperium controls more territory than it can effectively defend and should consider strategic withdrawal to more defensible borders. Others insist that any retreat represents unacceptable surrender, that humanity must hold every world it has claimed regardless of cost, because losing ground to Xenos or chaos means condemning billions of Imperial citizens to death or worse. The Primaris reinforcements and new equipment patterns deployed through the Indomitus Crusade have provided the Imperium with capabilities it desperately needed, but questions remain about whether these improvements prove sufficient given the scale of threats facing the Segmentum Ultima. The enhanced Space Marines and their superior weapons represent significant tactical advantages on individual battlefields, yet strategic challenges persist that no amount of improved infantry can address. The Imperium lacks sufficient naval assets to patrol all threatened systems, meaning that enemy forces can often reach Imperial worlds without being intercepted. The Administratum's bureaucratic inefficiency continues to hamper military operations despite Guilliman's reforms, with supplies failing to reach where they are needed and reinforcements arriving too late to affect battle's outcomes. The fundamental problems that have plagued the Imperium for millennia remain unresolved, and the addition of better soldiers cannot compensate for systemic dysfunction that undermines military effectiveness. The fortress worlds and defensive networks established during the Crusade provide strategic depth that may prove crucial in containing future invasions, yet their effectiveness depends on maintaining garrison forces at strength levels that strain the Imperium's ability to recruit and train troops. Each fortress world requires tens of thousands of soldiers to man its defenses, artillery crews to operate its weapons, and support personnel to maintain supplies and equipment. Multiplying these requirements across dozens of fortress worlds creates manpower demands that compete with the need for mobile strike forces capable of responding to threats across the Segmentum. Imperial commanders face impossible choices about resource allocation, knowing that strengthening static defenses weakens offensive capabilities, while maintaining mobile reserves leaves fortress worlds vulnerable to being overwhelmed if enemies attack in sufficient strength. The integration challenges between traditional and Primaris Space Marines continue to create friction within chapters throughout the Segmentum, tensions that may take generations to fully resolve. Some chapters have embraced the Primaris as full brothers, integrating them into existing company structures and treating them as equals despite their different origins and capabilities. Others maintain separation between traditional and Primaris battle brothers, assigning them to different companies or roles that reflect uncertainty about whether the new warriors truly understand what it means to serve in their chapter. These divisions weaken chapter cohesion at a time when unity proves essential for survival, yet the cultural and practical differences between traditional and Primaris Marines create barriers that cannot be easily overcome through simple declarations of brotherhood. The Segmentum Ultima stands at a crossroads as the 42nd millennium unfolds, its future dependent on decisions made by commanders who understand that their choices will determine whether humanity maintains its presence in the Eastern Fringe or loses entire sectors to the enemies pressing from all sides. The defensive networks established during the Indomitus Crusade provide foundations for resistance, but foundations alone cannot guarantee victory against threats that adapt and evolve faster than Imperial forces can respond. The isolation of worlds beyond the Great Rift creates situations where Imperial authority exists more in theory than practice, with local commanders making decisions that shape their region's futures without guidance from Terra or certainty that their choices align with broader Imperial strategy. The prophecies and warnings from sources both human and Xenos suggest that worse challenges lie ahead, that the conflicts of the current era represent merely preludes to catastrophes that will test humanity's survival in ways not seen since the Horus Heresy. Whether the Imperium possesses the strength, adaptability, and will to endure these coming trials remains uncertain. The Segmentum Ultima has survived 10,000 years of constant warfare, its defenders holding the line against enemies that should have overwhelmed them through sheer determination and faith that humanity's cause justifies any sacrifice. That same determination will be tested in the years ahead as new threats emerge and old enemies grow stronger. The Eastern Fringe, becoming a crucible where humanity's fate in the galaxy will be decided through blood and fire.